Across the vast lands of Inner Asia, many scholars have long spoken of a group of related languages often called the Altaic language family. In this framework, the languages of the Turks, Mongols, and the Tungusic Manchu peoples are placed together as part of a broad linguistic grouping. Earlier researchers sometimes linked this group to an even larger family, once called Ural Altaic, which also included peoples such as the Hungarians, Finns, and Estonians. Today, that wider classification is no longer widely accepted, yet the idea that the steppe peoples maintained long and intense contact with one another remains undeniable. Whether or not they shared a common linguistic ancestor, Turks, Mongols, and Tungusic groups lived in continuous interaction for centuries, shaping each other's cultures, traditions, and beliefs through constant movement across the Eurasian steppes. For historians of religion, the Altaic world appears less as a strict linguistic theory and more as a cultural reality. The available sources do not allow the reconstruction of a single original belief system shared by all these peoples. However, the evidence does reveal many rituals, myths, and religious concepts that appear across different groups and cannot easily be assigned to only one of them. Similar forms of worship, shared cosmological ideas, and related ceremonial practices suggest a broad spiritual environment that connected the nomadic societies of Northern Asia. Understanding this cultural sphere requires looking not only at the Turks and Mongols, but also at the religious traditions of the Tungusic and Manchu peoples. Yet information about the earliest periods of Tungusic history is limited and often fragmented. Most of the clearer sources appear much later, particularly around the rise of the Qing dynasty in China, when documentation became richer and more systematic. Because the earliest material is scarce and difficult to interpret, many historians approach the subject cautiously, using Tungusic traditions mainly for comparison, when studying the broader religious landscape of the Eurasian steppe. The names Turk and Mongol themselves appear relatively late in historical records. The term Turk becomes visible in sources during the 6th century of the Common Era, while the word Mongol emerges even later in historical texts connected with the Tang period and becomes clearer in the 11th and 12th centuries. Yet the peoples who would later bear these names certainly existed long before the appearance of those labels. Historians, therefore, speak of Proto-Turks and Proto-Mongols when referring to the earlier populations that preceded the formation of recognizable states and political identities. These early societies did not define themselves primarily through broad ethnic names. Instead, they were known through the names of tribes, confederations, ruling dynasties, or empires. A group might take its identity from a powerful clan, from the name of a ruling leader, or even from the names used by neighbouring peoples. As alliances formed and collapsed across the steppe, new identities constantly emerged, and older ones disappeared or were transformed. Before the creation of large empires that reached into China, India, Iran, Mesopotamia, and Anatolia, the ancestors of the Turks and Mongols were known mainly as pastoral communities, living in the open grasslands of Inner Asia. Their lives centered on the breeding of horses, sheep, and other animals, and their seasonal movements across the steppe shaped both their economy and their worldview. In this respect, they shared many similarities with other nomadic peoples of Eurasia, including Iranian groups such as the Scythians, Sarmatians, and Alans, as well as Germanic groups like the Goths. Still, describing them only as wandering herders would be misleading. From very early times, many steppe communities also took part in long-distance trade. Merchant caravans travelled across Central Asia, connecting the steppes with cities in China, Iran, and the Near East. Agriculture also appeared in certain regions, especially in river valleys and in the fertile oasis zones that later became known as Xinjiang. Even among nomadic populations, some communities settled temporarily or permanently near water sources where cultivation was possible. Archaeological and historical evidence also suggests that the ancestors of the Turks and Mongols once lived closer to forested environments before gradually spreading into the open steppe. Over time, they moved outward, occupying wider regions of northern Asia. Even today, some communities in these northern areas preserve traces of that older forest culture alongside their steppe traditions. As their societies expanded, the peoples of the steppe came to play a major role in world history. Their influence was not limited to warfare or political power. Their movements affected trade networks, cultural exchanges, and the spread of ideas across the entire Eurasian continent. Few regions of the ancient world remained untouched by their presence. At times, they settled and ruled vast territories. At other times, they swept across borders through raids and migrations that reshaped existing states. For more than 1,000 years, the centre of this dynamic world lay in the northern regions of what is now Mongolia. The sacred landscape known as Otukan, along with the valleys of the Orkhon, Selenga, and Tola rivers, and the mountains of the greater Khingan Range, formed the heartland of steppe power. From this core region, steppe confederations expanded outward in every direction. Eventually, their influence stretched from the Pacific shores of East Asia all the way to the northern coasts of the Black Sea and the lower Danube. Determining which languages were spoken in the early centuries, before written records appeared, remains extremely difficult. Without surviving texts, it is nearly impossible to say with certainty which communities should be described as Proto-Turkic, Proto-Mongolic, or Proto-Tungusic. Much of the debate centres on the powerful confederation known as the Xiongnu, who appeared along the northern borders of China around the 2nd century, before the Common Era, and led repeated campaigns against Chinese states. Early traces of Altaic languages appear only in scattered fragments, preserved in foreign sources. Chinese chronicles, Greek writings, royal titles, short poetic lines attributed to steppe leaders, and lists of rulers provide small clues about these languages. These fragments are few and sometimes difficult to interpret. Nevertheless, when combined with later linguistic evidence from Turkic and Mongolic languages, they offer hints about the deeper past of the steppe world. One of the oldest religious terms connected with this cultural sphere is the word Tengri, meaning the sky god. This concept appears in early references connected with the Xiongnu and represents one of the earliest known spiritual ideas associated with the peoples of Inner Asia. Chinese historical records preserve the term through phonetic transcriptions, allowing modern scholars to recognize the word that would later become central in the religious traditions of the Turks and Mongols. Historical and archaeological evidence suggests that the beliefs of the Xiongnu were not dramatically different from the religious traditions later observed among Turkic and Mongolic societies. In fact, many features also resemble those attributed to the Scythians of the Eurasian steppe. This similarity points toward a broad religious environment shared across the steppe long before the rise of clearly defined historical nations. Even the relationship between the Xiongnu and the later Huns remains uncertain. Some scholars see strong connections between the two groups, while others remain cautious. The Huns, who would later become famous in Europe under the leadership of Attila, appeared in Western Eurasia centuries after the Xiongnu dominated Inner Asia. It is possible that these groups shared certain cultural or linguistic links, but the exact nature of those connections continues to be debated. What seems clear is that the Great Steppe confederations were rarely composed of a single ethnic group. Instead, they brought together many tribes speaking different languages and belonging to different cultural traditions. Leadership often rested in the hands of a dominant ruling group, while the wider confederation included many allied or subordinate communities. Among the groups that appear in early sources are the Xianbei, the Wuhuan, the Hephthalites, sometimes called the White Huns, and several others whose ethnic origins remain uncertain. Some may have been early Mongolic peoples, while others could have been Indo-European or belonged to still different linguistic traditions. The Kyrgyz, whose name appears in ancient records and whose later inscriptions are clearly Turkic, were almost certainly part of the early Turkic world. Because of this complex mixture of populations, archaeological evidence alone cannot fully clarify the ethnic identities of early steppe societies. Physical remains suggest a variety of human types, rather than a single unified population. This diversity reflects the long history of migrations and interactions across the Eurasian grasslands. Despite these uncertainties, the available evidence allows historians to reconstruct a broad cultural picture of Inner Asia before the rise of the First Turkic Empire in the 6th century. Myths, legends, and ritual traditions that later became central to Turkic and Mongolic religion were already circulating in various forms across the steppe. Some of these ideas may even have developed through contact with Iranian steppe cultures, such as the Scythians and Sarmatians. The peoples of Inner Asia showed a remarkable openness toward the religions they encountered. Their inscriptions, political actions, and patterns of patronage all suggest a society that was willing to observe, support, and even temporarily embrace very different systems of belief, without feeling compelled to abandon its own older traditions. Rulers could extend favour to followers of many faiths, sponsor temples or clerics, and display respect toward teachings they did not fully adopt. This flexibility did not always mean deep conversion. In many cases, it seems to have reflected a practical and highly adaptable religious outlook. Buddhism, for example, clearly attracted attention among the early Turks, yet its impact appears to have remained limited in depth. It shone brightly for a moment, especially in the late 6th century, because it may have seemed capable of giving spiritual unity to a steppe empire that was searching for stronger ideological foundations. But that brilliance was brief, and beneath it the older beliefs of the steppe remained strong. Even when rulers leaned toward Buddhism for political or personal reasons, the wider population and much of the ruling elite remained firmly attached to the ancestral religion they regarded as their own. This becomes especially clear during the restoration of the Turkic state. Bilge Kaghan still showed interest in Buddhism and even imagined building a walled city, a sign of a more settled and organized future. Yet Tonyukuk persuaded him otherwise. His argument was simple and powerful, teachings that praised humility, gentleness, and withdrawal from worldly struggle could not serve a people whose survival depended on warfare, mobility, and strength. That response was more than a political calculation. It reflected a broader return to old traditions and a renewed sense of collective identity. The old language was strengthened, foreign influences were pushed aside. The memory of the founding ancestors, Bumin Kaghan and Istemi Kaghan, was revived, and the sacred power of Tengri, the sky god, along with the holy land of Otuken and the spiritually charged places of the earth, once again stood at the centre of public life. There are also hints that the Turks had at least some contact with Taoist ideas. The evidence is thin, and almost nothing certain can be said about the extent of that influence. Yet one fact is clear. Buddhism was not the only universal religion moving through the world of the Turks. The roads opened by monks, pilgrims, envoys, and merchants carried far more than a single faith. Along those same routes came Nestorian Christianity and Manichaeism. By the middle of the 7th century, Christian monks had already reached the Tang capital, where imperial permission allowed them to establish monasteries. Manichaean teachers also made their way into China and built communities there. Later, both of these religions would reappear across Central Asia, where they would join an already crowded spiritual landscape shaped by Iranian religious traditions, local cults, and the enduring sacred customs of the steppe. At the western end of the Turkic world, around the Caspian Sea, another striking religious story unfolded. The Khazars entered one of the most unusual spiritual experiments in medieval Eurasia. Their ruling circles eventually adopted Judaism, while the larger population appears to have remained divided among Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and older native beliefs. What stands out most is not the conversion itself, but the atmosphere in which it took place. The Khazar court became a place where rival faiths could exist side by side. Clerics debated before the ruler, and different religious communities lived under the same political order. This pattern reflects once again the broad tolerance that characterized many steppe societies. Their rulers often treated religion less as a narrow badge of exclusive identity, and more as a field of power, prestige, wisdom, and statecraft. Elsewhere among the Turkic peoples, different paths emerged. In Eastern Europe, the Bulgars gradually became Slavic in language and Christian in faith. Along the Middle Volga and the Kama, other Bulgar communities formed a powerful state and turned toward Islam. Their rulers, after accepting the new religion, sought learned men to instruct them more fully in its teachings. This moment brought observers from the Islamic world into direct contact with the Western Turks, and left some of the most valuable descriptions of their customs, beliefs, and daily life. By then, the Turkic world had become a vast and varied zone in which different branches of the same broader cultural family were entering Christianity, Islam, Judaism, or older local traditions in different ways and at different speeds. After the fall of the first Turkic imperial order, Central Asia may seem at first glance to have become an open field for the triumph of universal religions. Yet the old beliefs did not vanish. In the late 7th and early 8th centuries, there was in fact a clear revival of tradition. The rise of the Uighurs shows this especially well. After eliminating their rivals and building a new empire, the Uighurs consciously linked themselves to the earlier Turkic imperial heritage. Their inscriptions, written in the same runic script and in the same political style, show not a break, but a continuation. The state language, the forms of royal memory, and the old sacred geography all continued to matter. Even the smaller inscriptions left in remote places reflect ritual concerns and religious practices rooted in the same older worldview. The great turning point came in the 8th century when the Uighur ruler encountered Manichaean priests during a campaign into China. He brought them back to Mongolia and installed them in his capital, on the Orkhon. Their arrival changed the religious and cultural direction of the empire. Sogdian regained prestige and became once again a major written language of administration and belief. Inscriptions celebrating the new religion used both Turkish and Sogdian, showing that the adoption of Manichaeism was not simply a private act of devotion, but a major ideological shift. Still, conversion did not erase the older mental world. Like all great religious transitions, it worked by reshaping what already existed. Ancient myths survived inside new forms. Sacred stories were retold rather than destroyed. The famous origin legend associated with the Uighur ruler remained deeply Altaic in spirit even after being passed through a Manichaean setting. Its influence lasted for centuries and echoed among both Turkic and Mongol peoples, long after the original empire had disappeared. The Uighur domination of Mongolia did not last. The Kyrgyz descended from the Upper Yenisei, attacked from the northwest, destroyed the Uighur capital, killed the ruler, and scattered the population. Many Uyghurs fled southward into the oasis regions later known as Chinese Turkestan, There, they created something entirely different from the old steppe empire. In these new lands, their culture reached a far higher level of urban and artistic development. A society once known for war and mobility became associated with gardens, temples, manuscripts, and refined visual art. The old martial energy did not entirely disappear, but it lost its central place. Intellectual and spiritual life moved closer to the settled civilizations of Central Asia. In these new environments, Manichaeism became powerful, but Buddhism remained equally vigorous, and in many places even stronger. Uighur literature developed largely through translation rather than original creation, yet the sheer quantity of texts recovered from Turfan and Dunhuang reveals the richness of this world. Manichaean writings were abundant, but Buddhist influence remained alive in both literature and art. Nestorian Christianity also established deep roots in the Tarim Basin and beyond. It turned these regions into mission centres connected to the larger nomadic world of Mongolia and the steppe. Fragments of Christian hymns and theological writings show that this was not a marginal presence. It was part of the same religious competition that defined Central Asia for centuries. Other religions also left traces. Iranian fire worship and related traditions were known, though it would be careless to label every cult of fire in the steppe world as purely Iranian in origin. Fire held an ancient place in Turkic and Mongol ritual life long before outside doctrines attached themselves to it. Judaism too appears in scattered but meaningful evidence, including Hebrew texts and communities linked to trade routes and Iranian cultural networks. Islam, still growing as a force in Central Asia, began to appear more visibly through merchants, envoys, and wandering holy men. By this stage, the region had become one of the most spiritually crowded landscapes in the medieval world. What is striking is that, in spite of this pressure from major world religions, parts of the old religion still survived. It likely faded first in the cities and literary centres, where organised and scriptural traditions were strongest. But beyond those centres, among the nomads and in the frontier zones, older beliefs continued. The evidence grows thinner from the 8th century to the beginning of the 13th, yet it never disappears. Even the scripts tell part of the story. The Uyghurs adopted the Sogdian-derived alphabet, which would later pass to the Mongols, but the older runic script did not vanish at once. It remained associated with traditional culture and older sacred forms. This survival was not unusual. Religious communities often preserve their ancient writing systems precisely because they are bound to old ritual memory. Among the most revealing survivals is a divination book, written in runic script in a Manichaean monastery. Though composed in a changed religious setting, it speaks almost entirely in the language of steppe life and preserves a world of omens, signs, and practical sacred interpretation that belongs to much older traditions. Later, Turkish sources become increasingly valuable as well. The Great Dictionary of Mahmud al-Kashgari, though written in an Islamic environment, preserves sayings, poems, and concepts from a time when many Turks still remained outside full Islamic orthodoxy. Another major work from the same broader period reflects the mentality of a newly converted society, where Islamic ideas are present, yet beneath them older cultural layers still show through. Medieval dictionaries and glossaries also help by preserving words whose meanings reveal older concepts, even when the religions that produced them were already fading. As Chinese sources grew more silent about much of the Turkish world, new peoples rose to prominence in the eastern steppes and in North China. The Kitans, followed later by the Jurchens, drew the attention of Chinese historians. The Kitans in particular created a rich and significant religious world that deserves far more attention than it has often received. Though they adopted many Chinese forms, they also retained deep inner Asian features. Even when driven from China, they showed an astonishing ability to rebuild power elsewhere, suggesting that their nomadic identity had not been erased as completely as some once believed. History repeatedly shows that old traditions can survive even under the pressure of highly developed civilizations. As Turkish-speaking groups gradually moved westward, Mongolia itself became more open to peoples who would later be called Mongols. Yet it is often difficult to determine exactly which tribes were Turkish and which were Mongol during this period. Tribal names do not always offer a clear answer. Some peoples bore Mongol names but may have been Turkish in language or in the process of becoming so. Others lived in mixed environments and cannot be neatly classified. Christianity won real success among several of these groups, especially among ruling elites. The famous legend of Prester John grew out of this world, shaped by reports of baptized steppe rulers and transformed in the imagination of medieval Europe into a distant Christian monarch. As for the Mongols themselves, before their rise they were only one group among many, and did not appear especially privileged or distinguished. Their early reputation was that of a harsh and largely unconverted people. Only their success changed that. Once power gathered around them, the name Mongols spread across the steppe and beyond. In doing so, it absorbed much of the older religious heritage already present in Inner Asia. The great sacred themes of the earlier Turkic world did not disappear. They were retained, reshaped, or claimed as part of the ideological foundation of Mongol Empire. The differences that appear are real, but they stand within a much larger continuity. This older Turkic religious inheritance, later fully integrated into the Mongol imperial worldview, became one of the ideological engines of conquest. Yet the empire of Chinggis Khan was never built on religious exclusiveness. It rested on an old Altaic habit of tolerance, on respect for all religious specialists, and on a deep curiosity toward the beliefs of other peoples. At the same time, the Mongols guarded their own ancestral principles with great seriousness. Their fundamental law was not to be mocked or ignored. In this balance between openness and firmness, the empire found a system that allowed many religions to function within a single political order. The Mongol Empire also breathed new life into old traditions that had been weakened by centuries of pressure from universal religions. This revival could be felt even far away in lands where Turks had long ago accepted Islam, including Anatolia. The old customs had never fully died. In Islamic, Buddhist, Manichaean and Christian lands alike, they survived beneath the surface, waiting for a moment when political change would allow them to re-emerge. From the 8th to the 13th century, traces of that survival appear almost everywhere. Some peoples, such as the Pechenegs and later the Kipchaks, preserved older forms of steppe religion more directly, even while eventually entering the orbit of larger world faiths. The age of Mongol power is especially valuable because it provides far more sources than earlier centuries. By then, the religious life of Inner Asia can be seen from within and from outside at once. Native Mongol works, royal letters, decrees, privileges granted to religious communities, and the narratives of Persian historians, Western envoys, missionaries, Armenian chroniclers, and Syriac writers all combine to create an unusually rich picture. For the first time, the old religion of the steppe stands in clear historical light. It appears not as a vague collection of customs, but as a living system of sacred power, law, ancestry, heaven, earth, and divine favour. When the Mongol Empire broke apart, its official religious order also weakened. In China, the Mongols were gradually absorbed into Chinese civilization. In Iran, Central Asia, and the Western steppe, Islam eventually gained lasting dominance, though often only after a long period of resistance and partial adaptation. Yet even then, the old laws and habits of Chinggisid rule continue to leave traces. They can be sensed in later conquerors who sought to rebuild imperial authority in his image. Timur is one example. Babur is another. Even where full restoration was impossible, the memory of the old order remained powerful. In the East, however, there was no longer a force capable of creating a durable inner Asian empire on the old model. This opened the way for Buddhism to return in strength. Under new reforming leadership, it launched a successful spiritual conquest of Mongolia and spread there in its Lamaist form between the late 16th and early 17th centuries. Other Mongol groups, such as the Kalmyks and Buryats, later followed the same path. As always, the pre-Buddhist cults did not entirely vanish. They were pushed into a lower register, often reclassified as dark or popular belief, while the new official religion presented itself as pure and elevated. What later observers called shamanism became the core of this popular religious world, though in truth it preserved much that was older than the word itself suggests. The period between the collapse of Mongol imperial unity and the Buddhist revival is still poorly documented. Yet the surviving evidence points to strong ritual activity rooted in the older religion. This may reflect a decline from earlier high imperial forms, or perhaps the survival of beliefs long held by the common people beneath the formal ideology of rulers. In any case, the pattern was not limited to Mongolia. Across non-Islamic Inner Asia, the ancestral religion endured in popular life whenever foreign pressure weakened or political centralization broke apart. This long erosion was especially visible in Siberia, among scattered peoples such as the Yakuts, who had moved northward and lived far from the great centers of civilization. In such conditions, religious life did not disappear, but it became more local, fragmented, and exposed to many outside influences. Russian expansion deepened these pressures. Older sacred systems became increasingly archaic in form, sometimes reduced to their simplest elements, sometimes mixed with Christian motifs, and sometimes reshaped by contact with neighbouring peoples. Similar processes occurred in the Volga region and other northern zones, where interactions with Finno-Ugric groups also left their mark. Even so, the survival of ancient patterns in these distant regions could be astonishing. In the lands later called Kazakhstan, the transformation may have been less severe. Islam arrived there late and often only superficially, carried by clerics from nearby Muslim centres. Yet Christianity did not take root strongly enough to replace older ways. As a result, many visible traces of the ancestral religion survived beneath Islamic forms, just as they did in other parts of the Turkic world. The Islamization of the Turks deserves special attention because it became one of the great turning points in Eurasian history. Contact between Turks and Muslims began early, soon after the collapse of the First Turkic Empire. When the Arabs advanced into Central Asia, the political order of the steppe had already fractured. A decisive moment came when conflict around Tashkent drew Turkic forces and Karluks into a major confrontation with China. Their victory at Talas in 751 changed the future of the region. From that point onward, Central Asia moved not toward lasting Chinese domination, but toward the expanding orbit of Islam. Yet Islam did not immediately win the steppe. For generations, a rough balance remained between the Muslim states and the Turkic nomads. The Turks, blocked in one direction by a powerful religious empire, found another path through military service. They entered the armies of the Abbasids and the great dynasties linked to them as slave soldiers, guards, and commanders. This was not the end of their identity, but the beginning of a new role. Arab elites, wealthy and increasingly removed from war, relied on Turkic military strength. The result was one of the most important transfers of power in medieval Islamic history. By the 9th century, Turkish soldiers had become so influential that the Abbasid Caliph was forced to create a new capital in part to manage them. From there, they rose rapidly to positions of command, diplomacy, and provincial government. Many later observers have assumed that once these Turks became Muslim, they simply dissolved into Islamic civilization and ceased to carry anything distinct from their old world. That conclusion is too simple. Some certainly became deeply attached to Islam and fully at home in Arabic culture. Some displayed sincere piety and sought to perform the pilgrimage. But it does not follow that they abandoned all earlier beliefs at once. Much suggests the opposite. Turkish military communities remained separate. They lived in their own quarters, married under restrictions, and preserved close bonds with their place of origin. Muslim authors themselves notice this strong attachment to homeland and lineage. Such conditions favoured the survival of older customs for a long time. Even names reveal this continuity. Many Turks serving in Islamic states continued to bear unmistakably Turkic names, sometimes linked to animals, symbols, or older sacred concepts. These names were not empty labels. They point to a cultural memory that remained alive beneath the official religious surface. Some Turkish scholars, along with a number of non-Turkish art historians, who take an intensely pro-Turkish position, have argued that Central Asian traditions played a decisive role in shaping Islamic art. That claim cannot be discussed seriously without a real understanding of Central Asian visual culture. And among specialists of the Islamic world, that knowledge has often been uneven. It is difficult to say with certainty that Turkish influence transformed the whole of Islamic architecture, sculpture, or decorative art on a massive scale. That conclusion feels too broad. Yet in certain areas, the impact of the steppe world is hard to ignore. One of the clearest examples appears in funerary architecture. In lands where early Islamic custom favoured modest burial and discouraged elaborate monuments over the dead, the rise of tomb architecture is not easy to explain without looking toward Turkic and Inner Asian traditions. Another revealing example appears in royal imagery. Beginning especially in the period of Samarra, older Iranian models of representation gave way in some cases to a new image of supreme rulership, one that can be understood far more clearly when viewed against the pictorial traditions of Central Asia. The same may be said of miniature painting and ornamental design. It would be excessive to reduce the whole development of Islamic miniature art to Turkish influence alone, especially given the many Iranian and local currents at work, yet a remarkable number of themes that flowered later under the Seljuks, and beyond, seem to preserve motifs best explained through medieval Turkish narrative and symbolic traditions. That, however, makes the question more complicated, rather than simpler. Some of these visual themes may not have been exclusively Turkish. They may also have come through Iranian channels, or from an older cultural layer shared by both Iranians and Turks, long before either appeared in the historical forms more familiar to us. The close similarities between Iranian and Turkish mythology and iconography often reach into strikingly specific details, and there is no single explanation that solves every case. One possibility is that both traditions drew from a much older common reservoir that had spread across the Eurasian world in remote antiquity. That approach becomes even more persuasive when comparisons are made with the traditions preserved among peoples linked to the old Scythian world. Professional work in Islamic art has often led back to these questions, but they open onto such a wide field that only part of that discussion can be followed here. The use of Turkish slave soldiers also helped spread Islam in ways that satisfied those who wished to expand the faith. Alongside armies moved merchants and wandering religious men, carrying the Quran across roads, deserts, ports and caravan routes. Their efforts reached well beyond the formal borders of the Muslim world. In some regions, such as among the Khazars, they met with promising but mixed results. In others, like Volga, Bulgaria, conversion achieved firmer and more lasting outcomes. The greatest breakthrough for Islam in Central Asia came in the Karakhanid realm, centered around Balasagun and Kashgar. There, by the end of the 10th century at the latest, a Turkic ruler known as Satuk Bugra Khan accepted Islam and drew his people in the same direction. The precise date remains uncertain, but the importance of the moment does not. This was no empty court ritual. It marked the transformation of a region that had already passed through long centuries of Buddhist and Manichaean cultural influence. Kashgar emerged as a major centre of religion and learning, and at the same time remained closely connected to neighbouring worlds, where older non-Islamic beliefs still survived. That made it especially important. Some of the most valuable Turkish works of the medieval period were born in exactly this environment, where Islamic thought had become dominant, but the memory of an older sacred world had not entirely faded. From that point onward, the Islamization of Turkish peoples accelerated. In the lands of present-day Afghanistan, Turkic military elites, serving the Samanids, established the Ghaznavid Empire, a Muslim Turkish power rooted firmly inside the Islamic world. In some ways, that empire is less revealing than the Karakhanids because it developed under a stronger Iranian cultural influence. Yet even there, specifically Turkish qualities did not disappear. The Ghaznavids remained deeply shaped by their own background. This becomes especially clear in the tensions surrounding cultural identity. Mahmud of Ghazni, although known as a patron of poets and learning, could not easily overlook harsh depictions of Turks in the epic tradition. He ruled as a Muslim sovereign, but he also knew himself to be one of the very people being judged. That tension says much about the age. Islam had been accepted, but memory, ancestry, and inherited identity still mattered profoundly. Soon after, still nomadic Oghuz groups, who had not long before remained attached to older forms of belief, advanced under Seljuk leadership into Iran and then into Anatolia. Behind them came large numbers of other Turkic groups. This movement changed the Muslim world permanently. The Seljuks, and later the Ottomans, became Muslims and for political reasons embraced Sunni orthodoxy, the dominant and most useful form of Islam for imperial rule. There is no reason to doubt the sincerity of their faith. Yet sincerity did not mean total rupture with the past. Many earlier customs endured, and the Seljuks in particular showed a remarkable degree of tolerance toward populations that had not converted. In Anatolia, where Christians still formed a large part of society, this was especially visible. Muslim travellers moving through the region often noticed with discomfort how closely different communities lived together and how much room was given to coexistence. In the religious language of conversion, older concepts were not always destroyed. Instead, they were translated. The sky god, long central to the older world of the Turks, was gradually identified with Allah. The sacred force known as Kut, once seen as a divine life-giving favour that flowed through legitimate rulers, was recast as the grace granted by God. The command once expressed by the word Yarlek was absorbed into the vocabulary of mercy, pardon, and divine sanction. Pagan gods and spirits were reimagined as jinn, fairies, demons, or beings reduced beneath the authority of saints. Rituals once tied to old sacred powers were preserved by attaching them to holy men of Islam. This kind of transformation is well known in the history of religions. New faiths rarely erase the old world in a single blow. More often, they take over its language, redirect its symbols, and allow familiar habits to survive under new names. Among the wider Turkish population, the process was often even more complex. Many people became Muslim in name before becoming Muslim in a deep and fully internalized sense. Later, texts reveal this clearly. Even without outside testimony, the evidence inside Turkish literary tradition would be enough to show that conversion was gradual and layered. In one of the earliest Turkish versions of the story of Joseph and Zuleika, the work opens in proper Islamic style. Yet the author still seems to feel the need to explain the meaning of key religious words, including the name of God itself. In another case, a Turkish Quran commentary from a later period explains Allah by way of Tengri, as though the old sacred concept still provided the clearest bridge to understanding the new one. In the literature connected with Haçi Bektaş and the broader Bektashi tradition, older Oghuz themes remain deeply present. The same is true in the Book of Dede Korkut, where page after page preserves traces of an older sacred universe. Prayers to mountains, waters, and trees still appear with striking force, revealing the survival of a holy triad rooted in the natural world. That text is not simply a heroic tale, it is also a precious storehouse of religious memory. Epic literature and legend become especially important here, although they must be used with care. Their value is uneven. Some preserve ancient themes beneath later Islamic language, while others are so reshaped by storytelling that interpretation becomes difficult. The great cycle surrounding Abu Muslim and the later tradition of Koroglu contain material of real importance for tracing older patterns. By contrast, some other heroic narratives are less useful in this respect. Still, many Turkish epic traditions preserve unmistakably archaic structures. Among them, one of the richest in non-Islamic elements is the Saltuk name. It offers an especially vivid mixture of myth, wonder tale, heroic legend, and transformed sacred memory. Yet precisely because it is so full of layered material, it is not easy to analyze. For that reason, the Book of Dede Korkut remains especially valuable. Although the manuscripts are relatively late, the poetic core and many of the motifs carried inside them clearly reach back much further. The text preserves a world in which Islam is present, but not alone. Beneath it survives a far older universe of sacred landscapes, ominous signs, inherited formulas, and heroic values that belong to the deep past of the steppe. Even works that are fully Muslim in tone can preserve remnants of earlier traditions. Memoirs, court histories, and dynastic narratives sometimes contain small but revealing survivals. These fragments may seem minor when taken alone, yet together they show that Islamization was not a clean replacement of one civilization by another. It was a process of negotiation, adaptation, and layering. Many Turkish groups eventually found it easier to live within less rigid forms of Islam. Heterodox Shiite currents, or movements considered marginal by official Sunni standards, often provided more space for older customs to remain. The wandering holy men of the Turkman world, figures such as Barak Baba, Baba Ishak, and Baba Ilyas, claimed Islamic legitimacy. But in another sense, they stood as heirs to a far older religious type. They filled roles once occupied by ecstatic ritual specialists, mediators, healers, and wonder-working holy figures who belonged to the older steppe tradition. Their outward language had changed, but their social and spiritual function often remained strikingly similar. Over the centuries, the Turkish Muslim world split in more than one way. One current embraced Islam sincerely and fully, while still preserving whatever from the old religion could survive without openly challenging the new order. Certain royal and military customs continued in altered form. Practices tied to rulership, ritual warfare, banners made from horsehair or yak tails, the wearing of feathers on headgear, and harsh ceremonies surrounding enemies or dynastic legitimacy all suggest deep continuity beneath Islamic appearances. Another current became Muslim only to a degree and guarded much more of the old world, sometimes openly, sometimes in disguise. This second current did not vanish. In weakened or transformed form, it continued into modern times. Field observations in Anatolia, especially among nomads, but also among settled villagers, repeatedly show that beneath nearly 9 centuries of Islam, ordinary people have preserved far more from medieval and even older belief systems than is usually assumed. Similar results appear among Turkic-speaking communities in Afghanistan, Iran, and elsewhere. The old religion did not survive as a complete system, but many of its parts endured with remarkable stubbornness. For that reason, the study of ancient Turkish and Mongol religion cannot stop with the steppe alone. It is useful, perhaps even necessary, to look at the living traditions of southern Turkey and at the more fragmentary evidence preserved in other settled and nomadic communities across the wider Turkic world. The field remains immense. Only part of it can be used at any one time, and great care is needed not to confuse secondary details with the deeper structures that matter most. In fact, it may even be more accurate to say that the old religion of the Turks and Mongols has often been preserved more clearly in Muslim lands than in the far north, where scholars have traditionally gone looking for it. That may sound paradoxical, but it follows a familiar historical rule. Communities farther from the original political centre often keep older traditions longer. Anatolia offers one important case, especially when the enduring presence of Christians is taken into account. Until the beginning of the 20th century, the land that would become the Turkish Republic still contained a very large non-Turkish population, including Muslim Kurds, Armenians, and more than 1 million Greeks. Throughout the Seljuk period and in many later contexts, Turkish and Christian communities lived in close and often constructive contact. It is entirely possible that this produced a shared way of life in which customs, stories, and sacred habits crossed religious boundaries. In some cases, Greek legends preserved in Anatolia clearly echo themes familiar from old Turkish myth and epic. This overlap is too frequent to ignore. There is a strange contrast between the historical importance of the Altaic peoples and the small amount of serious work long devoted to their religious world. Only recently has their spiritual life begun to attract the level of attention it deserves. For generations, the history of religion focused overwhelmingly on Indo-European and Semitic traditions, while the sacred systems of Inner Asia remained in the shadows. A glance at the major encyclopedias and syntheses of religion makes this neglect obvious. The religions of the steppe were often reduced to a few pages, usually hidden inside broader chapters on Siberia, oral cultures, or primitive belief. Even when they were mentioned, they were treated briefly, unevenly, or as secondary matters. The same problem appears in works by historians of Central Asia. Many of them gave very little space to religion. Some reduced it to a few pages. Others almost ignored it altogether. A few, at least, recognized that beliefs and rituals mattered, but even then they often worked with too narrow a time frame, or with too few sources. Modern studies of Tibet or Mongolia may devote substantial space to Lamaism or to what is called shamanism. Yet they often say very little about the deeper pre-imperial background from which those later forms emerged. The pattern is repeated again and again. The subject is acknowledged, but rarely explored in full. This weakness does not come only from lack of interest. It also comes from a long-standing belief that the subject cannot truly be known. Many historians assumed that the ancient religion of the Turks and Mongols lay beyond recovery. Some argued that the inscriptions provide almost no help. Others dismissed the surviving evidence from Siberia as too thin and superficial to reveal the mythic and religious structure beneath ritual practice. Still others openly stated that the oldest Turkish and Mongol religion was impossible to reconstruct. That pessimism, however, goes too far. A patient and careful reading of the scattered materials, inscriptions, epics, travel accounts, legal traditions, later folklore, linguistic survivals, and comparative evidence from neighbouring cultures can produce results far richer than many earlier scholars imagined. The field remains difficult, fragmented, and unfinished, but it is far from hopeless. On the contrary, when approached with enough caution and enough breadth, it begins to reveal a religious world of great depth, continuity, and historical importance. The study of the ancient religious world of the Turks and Mongols did not begin recently. The foundations of this research reach back many decades, and in some cases more than a century. Early investigations were largely carried out by Russian scholars, and later by Soviet archaeologists. Because much of Central Asia and Siberia lay within territories controlled by the Russian Empire and later the Soviet Union, researchers from those regions held a near monopoly on archaeological exploration there. Excavations across vast steppe landscapes, mountain valleys, and river basins produced an enormous amount of material evidence. Yet this does not mean that scholars from other parts of the world played no role. Western and Japanese expeditions also contributed significantly to the exploration of Inner Asia. In the 19th century, several European travellers undertook long and demanding journeys through Central Asia, documenting landscapes, ruins, and cultural traditions that were almost unknown to the outside world. During the 20th century, international research expanded further. Archaeological missions from Europe and Asia conducted excavations across Central Asia and the deserts of Chinese Turkestan. These expeditions uncovered temples, burial complexes, manuscripts, and artistic remains that transformed understanding of the region's past. Among the most famous discoveries were frozen burial sites in the Altai Mountains and elite tombs found in northern Mongolia. Such sites preserved remarkable objects, textiles, weapons, horse equipment, and ceremonial items that revealed complex cultural traditions stretching back thousands of years. The publication of these discoveries attracted wide interest among historians and archaeologists across the world. However, not every finding became widely known. Some materials remained unpublished or difficult for Western scholars to access. As a result, researchers outside the region often had to rely on secondary reports or incomplete information coming from Soviet, Chinese, or Mongolian sources. Because of these limitations, historians frequently focused on written evidence rather than relying solely on archaeological material. Archaeology can provide powerful insights into ancient societies, but physical remains alone rarely explain the full meaning of religious ideas or symbolic practices. Objects and monuments may show how people lived or how they buried their dead, yet interpreting their deeper cultural meaning can be difficult without texts or traditions that explain them. When archaeologists attempt to reconstruct beliefs entirely from artifacts, interpretations can sometimes become speculative. Different scholars may propose completely different explanations for the same object or artistic motif. One well-known example comes from the animal art of the Eurasian steppe. Scenes showing animals locked in dramatic combat appear across many archaeological sites. These images are among the most striking artistic achievements of the steppe world. For a long time they were attributed primarily to the Scythians or Sarmatians. Yet similar styles appear among many other peoples as well, including early Turkic, Mongolic, and even Finno-Ugric cultures. Because of this wide distribution, scholars propose numerous explanations for their origin and meaning. Some interpretations link them to mythology, others to symbolic representations of cosmic forces, and others to purely decorative traditions. None of these explanations has been universally accepted, and the debate continues today. Written sources have often helped clarify such problems. Medieval inscriptions, historical records, and epic traditions sometimes provide clues that allow scholars to interpret archaeological discoveries more accurately. By comparing texts with physical remains, it becomes possible to understand how certain monuments or symbols functioned within the belief systems of ancient steppe societies. A clear example can be found in stone figures that appear near ancient burial sites across Central Asia. Some of these monuments represent enemies who were defeated or sacrificed by a warrior during his lifetime. Others represent statues honouring important individuals who had died. For a long time, these two types of stone monuments were confused with each other, leading to misunderstandings about their purpose. Careful comparison of archaeological evidence and written descriptions has made it possible to distinguish them more clearly and understand their different roles within steppe funerary traditions. The cultural world of the Eurasian steppe is enormous and extremely complex. Research on its religious traditions covers hundreds of topics, and new discoveries continue to appear each year. Early linguistic and epigraphic studies played a crucial role in this field. Scholars began collecting inscriptions, analysing ancient languages, and reconstructing historical contexts for these texts. Over time, many important contributions appeared from historians, philologists, and archaeologists working across different countries. Their work helped establish the basic framework for studying early Turkic and Mongolian religious concepts. Ethnographic research has also played an important role in understanding the spiritual traditions of Inner Asia. In fact, ethnographic fieldwork has often progressed more rapidly than archaeology. This urgency is understandable. Many small ethnic groups across Siberia and Central Asia have experienced rapid cultural change in the modern era. Languages have disappeared and traditional practices have faded as communities were absorbed into larger societies. Because of this, researchers have tried to document oral traditions, rituals, and folklore before they vanish. One of the earliest efforts involved collecting linguistic and oral materials from the peoples of Siberia during the 19th century. Scholars recorded myths, songs, legends, and epic poems preserved in oral tradition. These collections eventually grew into vast archives of folklore. Among the most remarkable examples is the epic tradition of the Kyrgyz people. Their legendary epic cycle contains hundreds of thousands of lines of poetry, transmitted orally for generations. This monumental tradition preserves ancient cultural memories and religious imagery that may reach back many centuries. Similar efforts were made among Mongolian communities. Researchers gathered folk narratives, myths, and ritual traditions preserved in remote regions. These texts provide invaluable insights into the worldview of steppe societies. They reveal how people understood nature, spirits, ancestors, and the forces believed to shape human destiny. Ethnographic observations made during expeditions across Siberia and Central Asia also recorded everyday beliefs and practices. Travelers described rituals performed by spiritual specialists, healing ceremonies, sacrifices, and seasonal celebrations connected with hunting, herding, or migration. From these accounts, scholars recognize the presence of a spiritual system often referred to as shamanism. Shamanism, however, is a complex phenomenon that cannot easily be defined as a single religion. In many cases, it functions less as a formal religious system and more as a set of ritual techniques used to communicate with the spirit world. Shamans were believed to travel between different realms of existence, interacting with spirits, ancestors, and supernatural forces. Their practices involved music, trance, ritual costumes, and symbolic journeys through the cosmos. Many researchers have studied shamanism from different perspectives. Some focused on its role within specific communities, while others examined particular rituals or symbolic tools used by shamans. Still others attempted to analyze its deeper meaning as a spiritual experience connected to human relationships with the natural world. There is little doubt that shamanic traditions played an important role in the belief systems of many Altaic societies. Yet it would be misleading to describe the entire religion of the Turks and Mongols simply as shamanism. The reality is far more complicated. Their spiritual world included a wide range of ideas and practices, some of which changed over time through contact with other cultures and religions. Researchers also noticed that many beliefs found among modern communities appeared to preserve elements from much older traditions. In some cases, these practices survived even after societies had adopted new religions, such as Christianity, Islam, or Buddhism. Older ideas did not always disappear. Instead, they were often reinterpreted within new religious frameworks. For example, sacred landscapes, ancestral spirits, and ritual practices connected with nature continued to appear in many regions, even after formal religious conversion. These survivals suggest that ancient belief systems were deeply rooted in everyday life and could persist beneath the surface of later religious traditions. At the same time, identifying the true origin of these beliefs is often difficult. Some traditions may have been influenced by neighbouring cultures, while others may reflect very ancient practices shared across large regions of Eurasia. Distinguishing between these possibilities requires careful comparison of linguistic, historical, and archaeological evidence. Scholars studying these traditions have also encountered many difficulties in interpretation. In some cases, famous legends were misunderstood for centuries, because researchers tried to explain them through incorrect cultural connections. Mythological stories sometimes became linked to traditions from completely different civilizations, leading to misleading conclusions. Over time, linguistic research has helped clarify many of these issues. By studying ancient words and titles preserved in inscriptions and historical texts, scholars have gained new insights into political authority, cosmology, and sacred symbolism within steppe societies. Terms associated with divine power, rulership, and sacred geography reveal how religious concepts were integrated into political structures. Another important area of research concerns ritual practices such as sacrifices, divination, and funerary ceremonies. These rituals reveal how ancient societies understood the relationship between humans, spirits, and the natural world. Some traditions involved interpreting signs in nature, while others focused on communication with ancestors or divine forces believed to control weather and fertility. Animal symbolism also played a significant role in these belief systems. Certain animals were associated with protective spirits, ancestral origins, or cosmic forces. Wolves, birds of prey, bears, and other creatures appear frequently in myths and ritual symbolism. These animals were not merely decorative motifs. They often represented deeper spiritual ideas about identity, transformation, and the connection between humans and the natural world. Attempts to reconstruct the ancient religion of the Turks and Mongols must therefore consider a wide range of evidence. Archaeology, linguistics, folklore, historical records, and ethnographic observations all contribute pieces of the puzzle. None of these sources alone provides a complete picture. Only by comparing them carefully can a broader understanding emerge. Even with such comparisons, certainty is rarely possible. The surviving evidence is fragmentary, and cultural traditions changed over time as societies migrated, formed empires, or encountered new influences. Religious ideas evolved in response to political transformations and social change. For this reason, any reconstruction of early Turkic and Mongolian belief systems must remain cautious. Individual sources should never be accepted without careful examination. Like witnesses in a historical investigation, each piece of evidence must be evaluated in relation to others. Some accounts may confirm each other, while others may reveal contradictions or later reinterpretations. Cultural diversity also played a major role in shaping religious traditions across the steppe. Nomadic, pastoral communities, forest hunters, and urban populations all developed different relationships with the natural environment. These differences influenced their spiritual beliefs and rituals. Political structures also affected religious life. During periods of tribal fragmentation, smaller groups often maintained distinct traditions connected to specific ancestors or symbolic animals. When large empires emerged under powerful rulers, religious symbolism sometimes shifted toward more universal concepts that reinforced imperial authority. One of the most significant examples is the idea of a supreme sky deity. In imperial contexts, this divine figure could represent a cosmic order and legitimize the rule of a single universal ruler on Earth. Such concepts reinforced the political structure of large steppe empires. Yet older beliefs never disappeared completely. Local traditions and ancestral cults continued to exist alongside broader imperial ideologies. Religious life in the steppe world therefore combined multiple layers of belief rather than forming a single unified doctrine. Because of this complexity, it is difficult to classify the religion of the Turks and Mongols within a single theoretical model. Elements of nature worship, ancestor reverence, animistic beliefs, and ritual magic all appear within their spiritual traditions. None of these elements alone defines the entire system. Instead, their religion can be understood as a dynamic combination of different practices and ideas. Some aspects resemble those found in many other cultures, while others reflect unique developments shaped by the environment and social structures of the Eurasian steppe. Religious experience itself is limited in its basic forms. Across the world, human societies often develop similar ways of interpreting nature, explaining misfortune, honouring ancestors, or seeking protection from unseen forces. What distinguishes each culture is the particular way these elements are combined and expressed. The spiritual traditions of the Turks and Mongols reflect this universal pattern. Their belief systems emerged from a long process of cultural interaction, adaptation, and transformation. Over centuries, these traditions formed a complex religious landscape shaped by migration, empire building, and contact with neighbouring civilizations. The word shamanism is very often used when describing the ancient religion of the Turks and the Mongols. Strictly speaking, this expression is not entirely accurate. It can create the impression that the entire spiritual life of these societies revolved around a single religious system. In reality, the beliefs of the steppe world were more complex. Still, the use of the term did not arise without reason. The practices commonly grouped under the label of shamanism appear in different parts of the world, but nowhere did they develop as clearly, as consistently, and as visibly as they did in the vast regions of northern and central Asia. Among the many peoples of the Altaic world, religious traditions varied from tribe to tribe. Rituals, myths, and sacred customs could differ significantly, depending on geography, language, or political history. Yet the practices associated with shamanism show a remarkable level of continuity across this enormous area. From Siberia to Mongolia and across the Central Asian steppe, the same basic patterns appear again and again, with only minor local variations. Such stability suggests that the tradition is extremely old. It likely developed long before the emergence of the historical states that later dominated the steppe. Shamanism itself is not simply a belief system. It is better understood as a set of actions performed by a specific individual in order to achieve certain goals. At the center of this tradition stands the shaman, a figure who acts as a mediator between the visible world and the unseen forces believed to influence human life. In many modern descriptions, the shaman is sometimes portrayed as a kind of magician or sorcerer. This image is misleading. The shaman is not simply a healer using supernatural tricks, nor a fortune teller who performs random acts of magic. In many communities, there were other individuals who practiced forms of folk medicine or ritual magic. The shaman was different. What defined this role was a powerful personal capacity that seemed to exist from birth. A shaman was recognized not merely by training, but by a unique character and psychological strength that set the individual apart from others. Even the most authentic shamans could sometimes become involved in conflicts within their communities. Rivalries, jealousy, or ambition could tempt them to interfere in areas beyond their proper role. In certain cases, they might attempt to influence political affairs or challenge the authority of tribal leaders. Such actions were generally viewed as abuses of their spiritual abilities, rather than legitimate expressions of their role. In principle, the shaman was not meant to act as a harmful figure. The tradition did not encourage destructive magic or malicious practices. The shaman's role was oriented toward restoring balance, guiding lost souls, and protecting the community from unseen dangers. Even when disputes arose with tribal chiefs or rulers, the shaman did not rely on supernatural force to harm opponents. Instead, the shaman accepted the authority of earthly power, even when that meant personal defeat. Later, traditions sometimes divided shamans into two categories: those who worked with benevolent forces and those who were believed to cooperate with darker spirits. Such distinctions appear in some Siberian communities. Yet this classification does not represent the original character of shamanism, and probably reflects later reinterpretations. The cosmology associated with shamanic belief usually describes the universe as consisting of several interconnected realms. In some traditions, the cosmos is divided into two levels, the sky above and the earth below. In others, there are three major realms: the heavens, the human world, and an underworld beneath the earth. These realms are not isolated from each other. They are connected through a symbolic pathway, often imagined as a cosmic axis. This invisible structure allows movement between the different layers of the universe. The world is also believed to be inhabited by numerous, unseen beings. These entities are often imagined in animal forms or hybrid shapes, combining human and animal characteristics. They inhabit the sky, the earth, and the intermediate regions between them. Although invisible to ordinary people, they are thought to influence weather, health, fortune, and the fate of entire communities. The shaman is the only person believed capable of intentionally entering a state that allows communication with these forces. The essential technique of shamanism involves reaching a condition of trance or ecstatic transformation. During this state, the shaman is believed to travel beyond the limits of ordinary perception. The origin of this ability can be explained in different ways. Some communities believe that the power is inherited within certain families. Others believe it is granted by spirits who choose the individual. In some cases, the future shaman undergoes a long period of training under the guidance of experienced practitioners. Whatever the origin, mastery of the role requires years of preparation. Before performing rituals, the shaman must learn the structure of the unseen world. Knowledge of the spiritual landscape is essential. the shaman must understand the pathways that connect the different cosmic realms, recognize the spirits encountered along the journey, and know the languages and customs of these beings. Without such knowledge, the spiritual journey would be dangerous. Preparation for a ritual is often complex. The shaman selects a place where communication between worlds is believed to be possible. The location may symbolize the cosmic axis itself. Special clothing is then worn. These garments are not simply decorative. They transform the shaman symbolically into another kind of being. Costumes often include feathers, wings, horns, bones, or other elements representing animals. These objects signify the shaman's connection with the animal world and the ability to move beyond the limits of ordinary human identity. Masks may also be used to conceal the human face and represent transformation into a spirit-like figure. Other ritual tools may be present as well. A staff shaped like an animal head may symbolize a mount used for spiritual travel. A polished metal mirror can represent the structure of the universe and serve as a symbolic instrument for perceiving hidden realities. Headgear, bowls, and ritual cups may also appear in ceremonies. Among the most important instruments is the drum. Its rhythm guides the shaman into trance and also symbolizes the structure of the cosmos itself. The surface of the drum may display images representing celestial bodies or mythological figures connected with the universe. Once the ritual begins, music and chanting gradually intensify. The shaman moves in circles, imitating the sounds of animals, leaping, crawling, or flapping the arms as if flying. These movements continue until ordinary awareness fades. At this point, the shaman enters a state of ecstatic experience. Observers may see the shaman collapse or move violently, as if struggling against invisible forces. During the trance, the shaman reenacts the journey through the unseen world. The ritual may depict climbing to the heavens, descending into the depths of the earth, or confronting powerful spirits that guard the paths between worlds. Despite its dramatic appearance, the ritual is never performed without purpose. The ceremony is organized to address specific needs. One common goal is divination. The shaman may seek knowledge about future events, asking spirits to reveal information hidden from ordinary perception. Another important function involves healing. Illness is sometimes believed to occur when a person's soul becomes lost or captured by hostile spirits. In such cases, the shaman travels into the unseen realm to retrieve the missing soul and return it to the body of the patient. In some rituals, the shaman accompanies the soul of the deceased on its journey to the other world. In others, the spirit of a sacrificed animal is guided toward the supernatural powers to which the offering is dedicated. In these situations, the shaman acts as a guide between worlds. For this reason, the shaman occasionally fulfills roles that resemble those of a priest. However, this function is secondary. The central role of the shaman is not to maintain an organized religious institution, but to mediate between humans and the invisible forces believed to shape existence. The word shaman itself did not originate in Turkic or Mongolian languages. Linguistic research suggests that the term first appeared among Tungusic-speaking peoples of northeastern Asia. From there, it gradually spread into other languages. European travellers eventually adopted the word to describe similar spiritual specialists across northern Asia. In Turkic languages, different terms were used. One of the most common was a word pronounced kam, which appears in historical sources describing spiritual practitioners. Among various Turkic groups, other titles also existed. Mongolian traditions used words related to an older Turkic term referring to a wise or powerful spiritual figure. The existence of female shamans is also well documented. In many languages, the same word referred to both men and women performing these roles. In Mongolian traditions, a specific title was sometimes used for female practitioners. Historical records from the medieval period show that observers from many different cultures encountered these figures. Travellers, historians, and diplomats described rituals involving music, chanting, and ecstatic behaviour. These descriptions strongly resemble practices still recorded among Siberian communities in more recent times. Evidence for shamanic traditions appears in sources dating back more than 1,000 years. Archaeological discoveries have also revealed objects that may have been used in similar rituals. Rock carvings in parts of Siberia and Mongolia depict masked figures, animals, and scenes that resemble ritual dances or transformations. Some scholars believe these images may represent early forms of shamanic ceremonies. Others suggest they could depict hunting rituals or mythological narratives. The interpretation remains uncertain, but the similarities between these ancient images and later shamanic symbols are striking. Written sources from early medieval periods provide clearer evidence. Historical accounts describe ritual specialists who predicted the future, healed the sick, or entered trance states during ceremonies accompanied by music and incense. These records indicate that such practices were already well established by the early centuries of the first millennium. Observers from neighbouring civilizations often describe them with fascination and sometimes confusion. By the beginning of the second millennium, these traditions were clearly visible across large parts of the Turkic world. Historical writers described ceremonies in which musicians played instruments, while a spiritual practitioner entered a trance, collapsed, and began to speak about future events or hidden knowledge. The persistence of these rituals demonstrates that shamanic practices remained an important part of steppe culture, even as new religions began to spread across the region. In later centuries, these traditions sometimes blended with new religious influences. In some Islamic communities of Central Asia, mystical figures appeared whose behaviour closely resembled that of earlier shamans. Stories described holy men who transformed into animals, travelled through invisible worlds, or fought supernatural creatures. Epic literature preserved similar themes. Heroes in these narratives often climbed sacred mountains, descended into underground realms, confronted monstrous beings, or communicated with spirits and magical animals. Such stories reflect the deep cultural memory of the steppe world. Even when new religious frameworks emerged, many older symbolic patterns survived within myths, legends, and spiritual traditions. Some medieval writers once suggested that Mongol shamanism had been derived from the religious traditions of the Uighurs. This interpretation is not accurate. What can be said with certainty is that the full details of Uighur shamanic practice are still not entirely known. In societies that later adopted large universal religions, older spiritual practices often survived, because they focused less on theological debates and more on practical matters of everyday life. These traditions addressed illness, fortune, protection, and uncertainty. Because of this practical nature, they could continue to exist even under new religious systems. Among the Mongols, shamanism was not simply a relic of the past. Some scholars once believed that it persisted only as a leftover tradition inherited from ancient ancestors. In reality, it continued to exert influence even during periods when political authority was strong. At times, shamans competed for influence with rulers themselves. Even when imperial power seemed dominant, spiritual figures could still attempt to shape decisions or guide leaders. By the 12th century, historical records begin to describe a special figure, sometimes known as the Great Shaman or Chief Shaman. This individual appears to have combined spiritual authority with leadership within the community. The same title appears among several steppe peoples, including pastoral groups and forest tribes. These figures existed among communities such as the Kipchaks, the Naiman, the Tatars, and others spread across the steppe and forest regions of Mongolia. Accounts from later historians even suggest that some members of the ruling lineage possessed qualities associated with these spiritual specialists. Stories describe certain leaders who displayed unusual endurance near fire or extreme cold. In one description, a nobleman reportedly slept beside burning wood, while sparks and ashes fell across his body without disturbing him. Such insensitivity to heat or cold was often associated with shamanic power. Similar traits were sometimes attributed to holy men and mystics in later Muslim traditions as well. The relationship between spiritual authority and political authority eventually reached a dramatic turning point during the rise of Genghis Khan. One of the earliest accounts of this period was written only a few decades after his death. It tells a strange story portraying the conqueror as someone who entered trance states and spoke words believed to be inspired by supernatural forces. These statements supposedly predicted future victories and events. Although such descriptions do not mean that Genghis Khan himself was a shaman, they suggest that he grew up in a cultural environment where shamanic practices were familiar and respected. During the early years of his rise to power, several influential shamans were closely connected to his family. One of them came from a lineage of spiritual figures known to his father. A grandson of that line eventually became a powerful shaman who claimed that the eternal sky communicated with him directly. According to stories told by later historians, this man declared that heaven had chosen Temujin and granted him rule over all lands. He also announced the name by which Temujin would become known to history: Genghis Khan. Legends describe this shaman performing remarkable feats. He claimed that heavenly spirits lifted him into the sky during trance. Another story says that he sat upon frozen rivers during the harsh winter months and melted the ice beneath him with the heat of his body. Such stories were widely circulated and repeated for generations. This shaman also played a role in the ceremony that confirmed Temujin as ruler. According to tradition, a group of men proclaimed that he would become Khan. Two of these figures were spiritual specialists associated with shamanic authority. Their presence gave the event an aura of divine approval. Yet as Genghis Khan's power grew, he began to distance himself from the influence of shamans. Although he respected certain traditions, he did not allow spiritual leaders to dominate political decisions. Several shamans who attempted to interfere with affairs of power eventually lost favor. Some were removed entirely from influence. One particular conflict became famous in historical narratives. A powerful shaman began to behave as though he stood equal to the ruler. Surrounded by his family and followers, he entered the royal camp freely and spoke to the Khan as if they shared the same authority. His ambitions grew further when he began attacking members of the royal family and spreading prophecies about the future leadership of the empire. At one point, he claimed that heaven had revealed that another member of the royal family would replace Genghis Khan. Such declarations created tension within the court. Eventually, the ruler decided to act. The shaman was confronted and taken away by strong men. Soon afterward, he died under mysterious circumstances. His body was placed in a sealed tent, and according to legend, he vanished, as if carried away by heavenly forces. With his death, the political ambitions of the shamanic elite were greatly reduced. Spiritual leaders continued to exist, but their power no longer rivaled that of the ruling authority. Observers visiting the Mongol Empire later described shamans as influential advisors, rather than competitors for power. Despite this decline, shamanic figures remained present at the Mongol court. Some rulers spent long periods consulting them about fortune and misfortune. In certain ceremonies, they participated alongside priests from other religions. The Mongol rulers were known for their curiosity and tolerance toward many belief systems, including Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam. Because of this openness, spiritual debates sometimes took place between shamans and foreign religious teachers. Travelers who visited the Mongol Empire left detailed descriptions of these practices. They observed rituals in which shamans called spirits during nighttime ceremonies. Meat was placed in the center of a dwelling as an offering. The shaman beat a drum while chanting until entering a state of frenzy. Eventually, the room was darkened and the spirit was believed to arrive. The shaman then presented the offering and asked questions on behalf of those present. These spiritual specialists were also responsible for determining fortunate or unfortunate days for major events. Military campaigns, journeys, and gatherings were sometimes delayed until the shamans declared the time favorable. Their approval could influence decisions affecting entire armies. Illness also brought shamans into action. When someone fell sick, visitors were often forbidden from entering the dwelling. People believed that harmful spirits or winds might spread the illness further. When the shamans arrived, they attempted to discover the hidden cause of the disease. Sometimes they ordered assistants to touch the patient and search for an object believed to contain the illness. In certain stories, this object appeared to move like a living creature once removed from the body. However, shamans were not always successful. If their predictions or treatments failed, they could face serious consequences. In some cases, rulers even executed spiritual practitioners whose methods did not save patients. Foreign observers also noticed that shamans sometimes gained material benefits from their role. During purification ceremonies involving fire, valuable objects placed in the flames as offerings occasionally ended up in the hands of the spiritual leaders themselves. Some travelers described a hierarchy among these practitioners. At the top stood a chief shaman who lived close to the ruler's residence. This figure supervised other shamans and participated in the most important rituals of the court. Even though the traditional role of the shaman did not originally include priestly duties, contact with organized religions gradually changed perceptions. As Mongol rulers encountered priests, monks, and theologians from other cultures, they sometimes expected their own spiritual specialists to fulfill similar functions. By the late medieval period, these traditions had spread across large regions of Central Asia. Some of the terminology used to describe shamans even changed. Words originally meaning scholar or learned person began to overlap with the title of spiritual practitioner. Despite the passage of centuries, traces of these beliefs remained visible in later texts and folklore. Many epic stories describe visions, dreams, and symbolic signs interpreted by wise men or spiritual guides. These narratives preserved fragments of ancient ideas long after new religions had become dominant. Dreams, in particular, played an important role in the imagination of steppe societies. People often believed that dreams carried messages about the future. In some stories, rulers received visions predicting their rise to power. Animals, celestial symbols, and strange transformations frequently appeared within these dreams. In one famous legend, a man dreamed of a great bird carrying the sun and moon before landing upon his hand. He interpreted the vision as a sign that a powerful leader would soon emerge from a visiting family. In another story, a prophet-like figure dreamed of a golden bow stretching from east to west, while silver arrows flew across the sky. The dream was understood as a symbol of future dominion over vast lands. Such stories reveal how the cultures of the steppe interpreted signs and symbols. Animals, weapons, and celestial objects were never random images. Each carried meaning connected to power, destiny, or divine approval. Another recurring theme involved the transfer of life or fate between individuals. Legends describe moments when someone offered their own life to save another. In one account, a man drank a fatal potion, believing it would absorb the illness, threatening a relative. Such stories reflected the belief that fate could sometimes be exchanged through sacrifice. Divination was not limited to dreams. Many different techniques existed to predict the future. Some involved examining animal bones, others relied on chance events such as sneezing or muscle twitching. Everyday occurrences could be interpreted as signs pointing toward coming fortune or misfortune. Among the oldest methods was the use of sticks or arrows. Bundles of sticks might be scattered upon the ground, and their positions interpreted as messages about the future. Similar practices had existed among ancient steppe peoples for centuries. Arrows carried particular symbolic importance. They represented the warrior who owned them and were often marked with identifying signs. Because of this close association with their owner, arrows could serve as objects through which destiny was interpreted. Another widely used object for divination was the ankle bone of livestock animals. These small bones were thrown like dice, and each side represented a different meaning. In many Central Asian cultures, this method survived for centuries and remained part of everyday games as well as fortune-telling. Texts devoted to interpreting omens also circulated in some regions. These manuals explained how to understand signs arising from daily life, from bodily sensations to natural events. Even simple actions such as cutting hair or nails could carry symbolic meaning depending on the day or circumstance. Animals themselves were often considered messengers of fate. The behaviour of birds, wolves, or other creatures might be interpreted as signs pointing towards success or danger. Such beliefs formed part of a much broader worldview in which nature and human life were deeply connected. Although many of these practices were later absorbed into new religious traditions, they continued to influence folklore and storytelling across Central Asia. Legends, epics, and historical narratives preserved the memory of a world where dreams, signs, and unseen forces guided the destiny of rulers and ordinary people alike. Across the steppe, world of Inner Asia, travellers and chroniclers often used a Mongolian term that roughly meant astrologer when describing the spiritual specialists they encountered among Turkic and Mongol peoples. Yet the meaning of that word was not always precise. In many cases, it was simply a convenient label used by foreign observers to describe individuals who interpreted signs, predicted events, or advised rulers about the future. Whether those practitioners truly understood astrology in a systematic sense is doubtful. The societies of the steppe did show a strong awareness of the sky, but this awareness did not necessarily mean they possessed a detailed scientific knowledge of the heavens. Around the first millennium, Turkic communities displayed a clear fascination with celestial events. The movements of the sky mattered deeply to them, yet their attention focused mainly on phenomena that could be easily seen and remembered. They observed the phases of the moon, watched for solar and lunar eclipses, and paid particular attention to the appearance and disappearance of certain star groups. Among these, the cluster known today as the Pleiades held special importance. Rather than attempting to calculate complex astronomical patterns, steppe societies often aligned their activities with these visible cycles. The sky was not studied as an abstract science, but treated as a living calendar that shaped the rhythm of daily life. Evidence that shamans themselves practiced something resembling astrology appears only in relatively late accounts. One traveller described how some shamans, particularly their leaders, possessed enough knowledge of the sky to warn their communities when an eclipse of the sun or moon was about to occur. Even this description suggests practical observation rather than a sophisticated theoretical system. Their knowledge was useful, but it did not resemble the highly developed astronomy of other civilizations. At the same time, the Mongol world did not exist in isolation. As the Mongol Empire expanded, encounters with other cultures brought new forms of knowledge into the steppe environment. Scholars from Iran and China entered the service of Mongol rulers and were welcomed at court. These learned men offered expertise in astronomy, astrology, and various sciences that had been cultivated in older civilizations. Historical records describe debates between traditional spiritual specialists and foreign astrologers when important political decisions were being considered. Before major campaigns, rulers sometimes sought advice from different religious figures, including Muslim and Christian astrologers, who attempted to interpret the signs of the heavens. Another path through which celestial knowledge may have reached the Mongols came through the cultural influence of the Uighurs. Some surviving texts associated with Uighur astrology appear to have roots in Indian traditions transmitted through Sanskrit learning. These writings likely carried ideas about stars, planetary forces, and symbolic correspondences that were not originally part of the steppe worldview. A remarkable inscription dating back many centuries also hints at an early tradition linking the sky with earthly power. In that text, an honoured ancestor is associated with a list of stars and with particular stones believed to correspond to them. According to the inscription, these stones were thought to bring health and strength to those who carried them. Such ideas suggest that the sky was not merely observed, but woven into a symbolic system in which celestial bodies, minerals, and human life were believed to influence one another. Yet despite scattered references like these, there is little evidence that steppe societies developed a deep or unified theory about the heavens. Their relationship with the sky remained practical, symbolic, and closely tied to everyday concerns, rather than abstract speculation. Among the many forms of divination practiced across the Turkic and Mongol world, one method stands out as both extremely ancient and remarkably persistent. This was the practice of reading the cracks that appeared on a heated shoulder blade bone. Known today by scholars as scapulomancy, the method involved placing an animal's shoulder blade over a fire and interpreting the lines that formed as it burned. The technique was not limited to a single region. It had been practiced across large areas of northern Asia since prehistoric times, and continued to appear in many communities long afterward. Over time, the practice became increasingly systematized, and in some places detailed manuals were created to guide the interpretation of the cracks. These guides suggest that what may once have been a simple ritual gradually evolved into a complex form of divination, with its own technical traditions. Even in distant lands, the method occasionally appeared in unexpected forms. In Anatolia, for example, shoulder blade divination existed in folk traditions that some people attributed to Greek shepherds. Whether this represents a shared cultural inheritance or a later borrowing remains uncertain, but it illustrates how such practices could travel and transform across different societies. The bone most commonly used for this form of divination came from a sheep, though other animals could also be used. In regions where sheep were rare, people adapted the ritual to local conditions. Among northern groups who relied on reindeer, the shoulder blade of that animal served the same purpose. The bone had to come from a recently killed animal. The flesh was carefully removed, and great care was taken to ensure that the bone was clean before it was placed over the flames. During the ritual, the person seeking guidance would focus their thoughts on a question while the bone was heated. As the bone dried and cracked, the resulting patterns were studied. These marks were believed to reveal hidden forces or future outcomes. The underlying idea was that the body of the animal contained a form of spiritual energy that could still respond to human concerns even after death. Historical accounts show that this method could influence major decisions. Among certain steppe peoples, if the bone cracked in a particular way while held over the fire, it could be interpreted as a sign to begin a war. If the pattern appeared differently, it might signal that peace should continue. In some traditions, several bones were heated at once, and the way they split determined whether action should be taken. Over time, the role of the interpreter became more specialized. The individual responsible for reading the bones' cracks sometimes had a distinct title separate from that of a shaman. In some languages, this practitioner was known by a specific term meaning something like bone reader. Although in many communities the shaman and the diviner could be the same person, in others they represented different roles within the spiritual life of the society. Historical references show that shoulder blade divination continued for centuries. It appeared in the armies of powerful rulers and survived in various regions of Central Asia long after the medieval era. Travellers reported seeing similar rituals among nomadic groups even in the 18th century. In some places, the bone itself gradually became an object of ritual importance, treated almost as a sacred item rather than simply a tool of divination. Another remarkable practice connected with steppe traditions involved a mysterious object often described as a rain-making stone. Many observers believed that shamans possessed the power to change the weather, and this belief became widely known among travellers who visited the Mongol world. Yet the ritual connected with the rain stone did not originally belong exclusively to shamans. Historical descriptions suggest that this object was associated with specialists who performed a specific ritual intended to influence the weather. These practitioners were known for conducting ceremonies that could call rain, snow, or wind. The ritual itself had a distinct name and was remembered as a traditional technique among Turkic peoples. Accounts from the medieval period describe dramatic examples of the practice. In one story, a sudden snowfall appeared during the height of summer after such a ritual was performed, extinguishing a dangerous fire that had been spreading across the land. Stories like this strengthened the reputation of the rainstone and the people believed to control it. The practice was considered to have Turkic origins, and historical records suggest that Mongols later learned it from neighbouring Turkic groups. Some early steppe confederations were already familiar with the ritual, while others appear to have adopted it through cultural contact. The object itself was described in many different ways. Some sources claimed it was a small stone found inside the bodies of animals such as cattle or horses. Others described it as a rounded mineral resembling an egg or a walnut. Its colour could vary widely, ranging from pale grey to red, blue, green, or brown. In certain traditions, the stone was believed to have fallen from the sky, leading some people to associate it with meteorites. The ritual usually involved placing the stone in water or washing it in a stream. Sometimes it was tied to a branch before being immersed. Through these actions, the practitioner attempted to summon clouds and bring rain. According to many accounts, the stone could also create snowstorms, violent winds, or thunder. Yet the power attributed to the rainstone was not always reliable. In some stories, the storm it produced turned against those who summoned it. Sudden winds or heavy rain could strike the very army or community that had hoped to control the weather. Because of this unpredictability, many traditions warned against using the ritual too often. Certain observers also believed the ceremony could disrupt the natural balance of the environment. If performed at the wrong time of year, it might harm plants and animals or attract destructive swarms of insects and predators. For this reason, experienced practitioners were said to use the ritual carefully and only when truly necessary. The most famous historical example comes from a battle in which opposing steppe forces both possessed rain stones. According to the story, one side attempted to unleash a storm against its enemies, but the weather they created suddenly reversed direction and fell upon them instead. As confusion spread through their ranks, the warriors reportedly concluded that the heavens were not on their side. To understand how the Turks and Mongols imagined the universe, it is not enough to list the sky, the earth, or the hidden world beneath them. What matters is the way these realms were connected to life itself. In their older worldview, the universe was not a dead structure made of empty space and lifeless matter. Everything that existed, from the greatest heavenly power to the smallest stone, was believed to possess an inner force. This force can be described only imperfectly in modern terms. It was something like spirit, vitality, presence, or a hidden master dwelling within each being. What made this idea even more complex was the belief that such power was never fixed in a single form. A living force could exist within one object, divide into many presences, or merge with other forces into a greater whole. This way of thinking shaped their understanding of nature at every level. The sky could be felt as one vast unity, yet at the same time it could also be experienced as a realm of many powers. A tree stood as an individual being, but it also belonged to the forest, and the forest itself could be imagined as a greater living presence bound to a region, to the earth, and finally to the whole world. Stones were not mute objects either. Each one had its own spirit, but a pile of stones could also possess a single shared power. Human beings were understood in much the same way. A person was not a simple, indivisible self. Each individual was made up of several inner forces and also shared in the living spirit of the family, the clan, the tribe, and even the wider political world to which he belonged. The same being could exist in many layers at once. A bear, for example, could be seen as one animal, but also as an expression of the larger power of all bears. In such a system, identity was fluid, overlapping, and difficult to define with sharp boundaries. In the oldest known stage of this vision, the universe seems to have consisted of two great regions, the sky and the earth. One stood above the other, enclosing or perhaps supporting it, though the exact image is difficult to reconstruct. At some later point, probably long before the medieval period had fully matured, a third realm was imagined below the earth. This lower world did not immediately take the central place it would later hold, but once it appeared, it slowly became an essential part of the cosmic map. It was described as the underground, the hidden interior below the land, and in time it came to be associated with darker meanings, including the place of the dead and the region of suffering. Even so, its role was not originally identical to the fully developed idea of hell found in the great scriptural religions. It began as another zone of existence and only gradually acquired heavier spiritual significance. Among early Turkic peoples and the Kyrgyz, the earth was imagined as a broad, mostly flat expanse, sometimes described almost as a square surface despite its mountains and ravines. Above it rose the sky, which could be pictured in two ways at once. It might be understood as a circular vault arching over the world, yet also as something parallel to the earth. This looks contradictory from a modern point of view, but older cosmologies often accepted multiple images without feeling the need to force them into a single logical diagram. One symbolic form tied to this cosmic order was the turtle, a creature that could serve as a kind of miniature model of the world. The idea survived for a very long time. At the same time, early inscriptions suggest that the universal order depended on the proper alignment between heaven and earth. Disaster came when that harmony was broken, when sky and earth were thrown into confusion. It is possible that in the earliest imagination the border between these realms was less rigid than it later became. Shamanic thought preserved the idea that passage from one level of existence to another was possible, though only for certain gifted individuals. In many traditions, it was even said that in ancient times this movement had once been easier. The distance between worlds may not always have seemed absolute. The world itself had limits. In older thought, it may have been bordered by a cosmic river or encircled by a watery edge, an image that appears in many ancient traditions. In some cases, this boundary may have been inspired by real geographical horizons transformed into sacred geography. A great outer barrier, perhaps imagined as a mountain wall, may also have marked the limits of the known world. Later, under new intellectual influences, the image of the world shifted. Circular maps began to appear, and the old square Earth was reimagined in forms more familiar to the learned traditions of the Islamic world. The physical universe was also described through elemental principles. One old account presents the world as made of water, fire, earth, and air. This fourfold scheme survived in certain later Turkish communities as well. Other reports are less reliable and seem to confuse older beliefs with foreign systems. What matters most is that the world was not seen as random. It was built in layers, governed by order and filled with living powers. The sky itself was often treated as a structured realm rather than an empty dome. In later shamanic traditions, it was divided into levels, usually 7 or 9. These numbers appear again and again across inner Asian cosmology and ritual. Each level had its own beings and powers. Ancient evidence suggests that the idea may have deep roots. Rock art from the steppe sometimes shows sacred trees with 7 or 9 branches, images strikingly close to later ritual symbolism. In ceremonies, shamans climbed not only literal trees or poles, but also a cosmic path imagined through them. Each notch cut into a ritual tree could represent another stage in the ascent through the layered universe. The same symbolic structure could also apply in reverse to the descent into the underworld. In later folklore, the earth was sometimes imagined resting on a mighty animal, or on a stack of living creatures whose movements caused earthquakes and instability. This image, too, was probably older than its surviving forms suggest. Steppe animal art, with its dramatic scenes of struggle and cosmic tension, may preserve fragments of that forgotten mythic imagination. Binding all these realms together was the world axis, the great vertical link joining heaven, earth, and the depths below. This axis could appear in many forms. It might be a mountain, a tree, a flame, a pillar, a plume of smoke, or the central post of a nomad's tent. The round tent itself was more than a shelter. It was a miniature universe. Its roof reflected the dome of the sky, and its smoke hole formed a vertical opening through which the worlds connected. The axis was not a deadline, it was a route of movement. Shamans used it in ecstatic journeys, but they were not alone. Souls of the dead, wandering spirits, sacrificial animals, birds that crossed the upper air, and even creatures of the waters were all imagined as participants in this cosmic traffic. Ritual life made this invisible road visible. Ceremonies sometimes included a sacred birch tree set before the tent, or a group of trees arranged in symbolic order. Thin cords or cloth strips linked them together, representing the road to the sky. Trees could be cut with notches to mark the stages of ascent. In this sacred landscape, the eagle stood as guardian of the height. It was not only the noblest of birds, but also the being that flew closest to the divine. Again and again the image returns. A great bird perched on the top of the world tree, watching over the connection between realms. Direction also mattered. Orientation changed over time. In one earlier system, the ruler faced east, and the opening of the tent face the same direction. Inscriptions support this pattern by describing east as the front, west as the back, south as the right side, and north as the left. Later, however, orientation shifted toward the south, especially under new political and cultural influences. Even this change shows how cosmic space remained alive and meaningful, rather than abstract. When it comes to creation itself, the evidence is surprisingly thin. The early Turks and Mongols do not seem to have been deeply preoccupied with detailed stories about how the universe first began. One famous inscription gives only a brief and powerful formula. When the blue sky above and the dark earth below came into being, human beings appeared between them. This statement is important, but it does not necessarily describe creation out of nothing. The wording suggests formation, ordering, or emergence rather than a philosophical doctrine of absolute beginning. The same language appears elsewhere in contexts where people are said to have been made in a certain way or brought into a particular condition. The emphasis is less on metaphysical creation than on placement within a cosmic order. Even so, later developments show that ideas about creation did grow and change. During the earlier imperial age, the highest divine power wasn't always presented as an eternal creator in the later monotheistic sense. Yet the concept of endlessness was not unknown. The idea of what is everlasting already existed in their vocabulary. Over time, especially as Turks and Mongols came into contact with religions that place strong emphasis on creation, older beliefs were reinterpreted through new language. Some later stories about the first human beings appear to preserve fragments of older myths, mixed with outside influences. In one tradition, a cave in a black mountain filled with mud after a flood. The heat dried that mud, and from it the first man emerged. Much later, another flood produced the first woman. Different versions of this story survived among different Turkic groups. In another form, the first man originated from a piece of clay warmed by the sun. These tales preserve old symbols that likely mattered deeply. The cave, the flood, the mud, the heat of sunlight, and the moon-linked names associated with the first ancestors. More elaborate creation myths are found only in later periods. One famous version begins in a time before sky and earth existed, when everything was covered by water. Above that endless water there was a supreme divine being who then brought forth another being resembling himself, and gave him the name of man. Yet this story clearly reflects influence from outside religious traditions and cannot simply be read as a pure survival of early steppe religion. Many of the later narratives carry similar marks of borrowing while still preserving older patterns such as sacred numbers, layered worlds, and cosmic waters. In Anatolia, our Turkish creation stories took on forms shaped heavily by Islam, though sometimes they still kept symbols that may have been older. In one version, God sends an angel to gather earth in order to create humanity, but the world begs not to be wounded because it knows mankind will sin and suffer. Other angels refuse, and only the angel of death fulfills the command. In another tradition, creation begins with a green sea from which a precious stone emerges. That stone is divided, and from it come sacred lights linked to holy figures. These stories belong to a later religious environment, yet they still show how powerful the imagery of water, stone, light, and living earth remained. Foreign observers also left reports about Turkic and Mongol ideas of creation, but these must be treated cautiously. Some describe them as worshippers of a creator of heaven and earth. Others report strange and doubtful claims, including the idea that certain idols were considered the makers of humankind. Such accounts often reflect misunderstanding as much as accurate observation. As Turks and Mongols came into closer contact with Jews, Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and Manichaeans, they were increasingly drawn into theological debates. When asked directly who had created the world, they often answered by pointing to heaven. Yet even here a subtle distinction emerged. There was the visible sky, and then there was the heavenly creator associated with it, but not always identical to it. Over time, this distinction became clearer. The sky itself was gradually separated from the personal creator who ruled above it. By the age of the Mongol Empire, Western visitors frequently described the Mongols as speaking of a creator god, and some even recorded prayers addressed to the maker of the universe. This shows not a sudden invention, but a reinterpretation of older celestial belief through the language of wider religious contact. There is even less evidence for a developed vision of the end of the world. The Turks and Mongols seem to have shown less interest in final destruction than in the structure of the living cosmos. Still, a few formulas survive. Early inscriptions declare that as long as the sky above does not collapse and the earth below does not split apart, the political order should endure. Elsewhere, there are cries calling for the sky to fall. In later traditions, mountains topple, the ground opens, rivers dry up, seas withdraw, the sun and moon darken, and stars fall from heaven. These images clearly resemble the apocalyptic language of the great world religions, but they may also rest on older fears of cosmic disorder, the breakdown of balance between heaven and earth. At the center of this entire vision stands the sky itself. One of the oldest known religious words in the Turkic and Mongol world is the name used for heaven, a word that survived enormous historical change and endured for nearly 2,000 years. In different languages and dialects, it shifted in sound, but it remained recognizably the same. This word could mean the visible sky, but it could also mean the heavenly God. The distinction between the physical heavens and the divine power residing in them was not always sharply drawn. In the great imperial inscriptions of the Turks, and later in the Mongol world, heaven occupies the highest place. It is not merely part of nature. It is the supreme authority behind political order. The ruler governs because heaven has chosen him. He is sent by heaven, raised by heaven, protected by heaven, and in some traditions even described as heaven's son. This language appears very early, especially in the political theology of steppe empires. The ruler is not simply a strong man. He is the one whom heaven has marked out for command. Sometimes this relationship was described in almost sacred terms. The ruler could be called heavenly, divine, or godlike. He trusted completely in the protection of heaven, and the historical record shows that this was more than empty ceremony. Victories, survival in battle, and the preservation of the state were all attributed to heavenly favour. Leaders believed that heaven actively intervened in human affairs, especially in times of danger. This did not mean that human action had no role. Advisors, generals, and nobles could proclaim a ruler or help place him on the throne. Yet such action was never thought sufficient by itself. Human choice only expressed a higher will already present. If someone rose to power, it was because heaven had allowed it. Even those appointed to lesser offices could say that they had been placed there by divine command. So long as order prevailed, the ruler empowered by heaven seemed enough to sustain the world below. But when the empire weakened, when tribes scattered and unity broke apart, the great heavenly power became less sharply focused. Its authority seemed to fragment, and more local divine beings rose in prominence. In times of imperial strength, heaven stood above all as the god of order, legitimacy, and universal rule. In times of political collapse, religious life became more scattered as well. Heaven was not only the god of the ruler, it also became the god of the people. Some texts even speak of a personal relationship with this divine power, using words that mean my God, or expressing servitude directly to heaven. In that sense, the god once most closely tied to kingship could also be approached by ordinary people. Yet even then, the political dimension never disappeared. Heaven remained the source of authority, destiny, and collective survival. It also expanded beyond one tribe or one state. Heaven ruled the whole world, including enemies living in distant lands. For this reason, the wars of the steppe empires could take on a sacred tone without becoming doctrinal holy wars in the later religious sense. Rebellion against the ruler was also rebellion against heaven. Victory in battle was understood as proof of heavenly favour. Expansion, conquest, law-giving, and the restoration of order could all be described as part of heaven's design. From the time of the early steppe empires onward, this belief appears again and again. Success in war was credited to heaven's aid. Armies that had lost courage were said to be driven onward by heavenly pressure. Great conquerors believed that their rise had been granted by the eternal heaven, and their successors continued to speak in the same language. Letters sent by Mongol rulers declared openly that their authority, their mission, and even their victories had been given by the living heaven. To resist them was not merely political defiance. It was opposition to the cosmic order they believed themselves chosen to establish. In early Turkic and Mongol belief, the supreme sky deity was sometimes addressed with titles that resembled those used for earthly rulers. In rare cases, this heavenly power was even referred to as a Khan, a title normally reserved for human sovereigns. Such usage appears only occasionally in the oldest inscriptions, but in later centuries it became much more common. When the name Tengri was paired with royal titles, the intention was not simply to elevate the sky itself, but to emphasize the divine authority believed to govern the world from above. One expression in particular became widely known: the eternal heavenly Khan. When Turks and Mongols engaged in religious debates with followers of other traditions, they often insisted on a striking idea: that God was the same for all peoples. This claim appeared repeatedly in conversations with Christians, Muslims, and others who encountered the steppe empires. Although it becomes especially visible during the Mongol period, the concept likely existed much earlier. In diplomatic correspondence sent to rulers in Europe and the Middle East, Mongol leaders openly spoke of a single divine power that ruled over all humanity. One famous letter addressed to a European monarch expressed the idea in blunt terms, presenting the voice of the divine as declaring itself the only God. Another message sent by a Mongol ruler to the Pope argued that different religions might appear distinct, yet all who honoured the eternal heaven were, in a sense, following the same truth. According to this view, people who respected the commands of heaven were not necessarily opposed to Christianity or any other faith. The divine authority above the sky was considered universal, and obedience to it could take different forms. This attitude toward religion also appeared in the decrees issued by Mongol rulers. Certain edicts declared that religious leaders of any tradition could be exempt from taxation if they prayed for the well-being of the ruler. The principle behind these orders was simple. Spiritual specialists, regardless of their beliefs, were seen as mediators, capable of appealing to the powers of heaven. If their prayers benefited the empire, they deserved protection. One order, attributed to a Mongol ruler, illustrates this clearly. It stated that temples and places devoted to spiritual practice should be respected, and that those who spent their lives reading sacred texts and calling upon heaven should not be burdened with taxes or obligations. These individuals were expected to pray for the long life of the ruler, and in return they received official protection. The famous conversation between a Mongol ruler and a European traveller also reflects this same philosophy. During the discussion, the ruler explained that just as the human hand has many fingers, humanity has been given many different paths. This metaphor captured a fundamental principle of steppe spirituality. Religious diversity was not necessarily a contradiction. Different traditions might coexist under the same sky. Some historical sources even describe how steppe envoys criticized foreign rulers who mistreated them by appealing to the authority of a single universal god. According to these accounts, they argued that the same divine power ruled over all nations and would ultimately judge disputes between them. Ancient Turkic inscriptions also describe the sky using specific attributes. It is often described as high above, emphasizing its position over the world, and also as blue or deep-coloured, reflecting the endless vault visible above the steppe. The sky is portrayed as powerful and commanding, though the inscriptions rarely describe its power using technical terms. Instead, its authority is implied through its actions. In these texts, the sky stands above the earth as the ultimate source of order. When disasters strike, they are often explained as signs that heaven has withdrawn its favour. In several inscriptions describing moments of danger for the Turkic people, the message is clear. When heaven ceases to protect a nation, calamity follows. The famous opening lines of early steppe inscriptions illustrate this cosmic hierarchy. They begin by describing the blue sky above and the dark earth below, establishing a vertical order that frames the entire universe. This structure reflects both physical geography and spiritual belief. Another important description of the sky appears in Mongol tradition, where it is repeatedly called eternal. The idea of an everlasting heaven becomes central in Mongol political language. Official documents, royal letters, and imperial decrees frequently refer to the eternal heaven as the ultimate authority behind the ruler's power. In certain diplomatic texts, the phrase eternal heaven is even translated as the living God. This translation suggests that the sky was not merely a physical object, but a divine presence that existed forever and influenced human history. The belief that the divine was eternal also shaped ideas about human destiny. Some texts express the hope that people might share in this eternity through divine favour. Another concept closely connected with heaven was power. This power was believed to flow from the sky and enter the world through chosen individuals. In early steppe societies, the ruler was considered the primary recipient of this heavenly force. Historical accounts often explain military victories by referring to this divine power. When armies succeeded in conquest, the explanation was simple. Heaven had granted them strength. Without this support, even the greatest leaders could fail. Inscriptions written by Turkic rulers sometimes describe their authority in these terms. They claim that heaven granted them the strength necessary to rule and to defend their people. Yet this strength was not considered permanent. If a ruler lost heaven's favour, he could lose power just as easily. Even animals and ordinary people were thought to benefit from this cosmic force. In certain texts, a weary horse finds its path and survives danger through the power of heaven. Such stories reveal how deeply this idea permeated the worldview of steppe cultures. Closely connected with heavenly power were other blessings often described as fortune, happiness, or destiny. These gifts were not limited to rulers alone. They could also belong to ordinary people and even animals, reflecting the belief that the universe was filled with invisible forces shaping the course of life. Despite its immense authority, the sky was not portrayed as constantly intervening in every detail of existence. Its actions were often indirect. The ruler who governed on earth was expected to act in harmony with heaven's will. When he succeeded, his authority appeared legitimate. When he failed, it suggested that the cosmic balance had been disturbed. Although the sky possessed the power to create and sustain life, early steppe traditions rarely focused on creation itself. One scholar from Central Asia wrote that heaven was responsible for the growth of plants, suggesting a subtle but essential role in maintaining life. At times, heaven was believed to influence human decisions through psychological pressure. Certain texts describe individuals suddenly gaining courage or determination, as if driven by an unseen force. This influence was interpreted as a sign of heavenly intervention. The commands of heaven were believed to guide the fate of rulers and nations. Yet these commands were rarely described in detail. They were understood as divine decrees that shaped the course of events. In some cases, shamans were thought to interpret these heavenly messages. They might claim to transmit divine instructions during rituals or ecstatic experiences. However, earlier traditions suggest that heaven could communicate directly with rulers, without intermediaries. Dreams were one way these messages might appear. Historical stories describe rulers receiving divine instructions while sleeping. In one tale, a leader dreams that heaven commands him to release someone he once favoured, demonstrating how spiritual authority could influence personal decisions. In addition to dreams, heavenly messages might appear through mysterious figures or signs. Sometimes these were described as spirits that visited people during sleep. At other times, they appeared in symbolic forms such as animals. Among these animals, the eagle held a special place. As the bird that flew closest to the sky, it became a natural symbol of divine authority. Stories frequently describe heavenly messengers appearing in the form of powerful birds, especially eagles. In some legends, an eagle is said to deliver divine laws to a ruler. The story describes the bird descending from the sky, speaking to the leader, and delivering sacred commands that would later form the foundation of political order. Other signs of heaven's will could appear through natural phenomena or unusual events. Bright lights in the sky, mysterious animals, or extraordinary individuals might all be interpreted as messages from above. One legend tells of a radiant light descending from the sky and revealing a woman of supernatural beauty. Such stories reinforce the belief that heaven could communicate through visible signs. Although heaven was powerful and protective, it could also punish wrongdoing. The most severe punishment associated with the sky was death. Actions that threatened the cosmic order were believed to provoke divine anger. Rebellion against a legitimate ruler, betrayal of one's people, or submission to enemies could all be interpreted as offences against heaven. When such actions occurred, disasters were often explained as divine punishment. Entire communities might suffer defeat or destruction because heaven had withdrawn its support. This idea also explains why defeat in war was often interpreted as a sign that heaven no longer favoured a particular people. In such cases, leaders believed that their misfortune reflected a loss of divine approval. In addition to war and politics, everyday behaviour could also attract heaven's displeasure. Breaking certain taboos was believed to bring immediate consequences. One example involves water taboos. Washing clothes in inappropriate circumstances could provoke a storm or lightning strike. Such events were interpreted as signs that heaven had been offended. Lightning and thunder themselves were considered direct expressions of heavenly power. When lightning struck a person or an animal, it was often interpreted as evidence that the sky had become angry. Among some communities, families whose relatives had been killed by lightning were forced to observe special restrictions for many years. Animals struck by lightning were considered dangerous and were often avoided as food. These practices reflect the deep fear and respect inspired by storms. Thunder was not merely a natural event, but a sign that the sky itself was acting. Even so, people believed they could sometimes defend themselves against these forces. Carrying certain stones or performing rituals might protect individuals from lightning. In earlier times, some groups even shot arrows toward the sky during storms. This strange ritual suggests that thunder was imagined as a living force that could be confronted. Over time, thunder was sometimes portrayed as a dragon-like creature moving across the heavens. Similar beliefs appear across northern Asia, where storms are imagined as enormous beasts roaring through the sky. In the spiritual imagination of early Turkic and Mongol societies, water held a profound place in the order of the world. It was counted among the fundamental elements that formed the universe. At first glance, it appeared to oppose fire, since water extinguishes flame. Yet the two were also deeply connected, because fire itself depends on wood, and wood grows through the nourishment of water. In this sense, water and fire were not simply rivals. They formed a cycle within nature, each sustaining the existence of the other. Water's role in fertility and growth was widely recognized. Because it nourished the land and allowed life to flourish, it came to be regarded as one of the essential sources of existence. In quieter traditions, it was sometimes described in maternal terms, much like the earth itself. Rain descending from the sky strengthened this association, since water appeared to flow from heaven to earth and return again through evaporation and clouds. Yet, among the Turks and Mongols, another quality of water attracted particular attention: its purity. Across many societies of Inner Asia, water was treated with an unusual level of caution. Among Uighur communities, Mongols, Siberian peoples, Altai groups, and even some heterodox communities in modern Anatolia, strict taboos developed around the treatment of water. Polluting a river or spring with bodily waste was forbidden. In many traditions, washing clothes or household vessels directly in running water was also discouraged. Some early travellers even reported that certain steppe groups avoided bathing or washing themselves in rivers altogether, fearing that contact might defile the spirit believed to inhabit the water. Other observers described similar customs among the Mongols. During certain seasons, people avoided entering rivers during the day, refrained from washing their hands in flowing water, and did not pour water into precious metal containers. The reasoning behind these restrictions was simple, yet powerful. Water possessed its own spirit, and that spirit could not be insulted by acts considered impure. Additional reports confirm how strictly these customs were enforced. In some periods, individuals who deliberately polluted water could face severe punishment. Washing clothing in rivers was avoided, and household objects were rarely cleaned in streams. The idea behind these practices was not merely hygiene, but reverence. Water was seen as a living presence, and careless behaviour risked offending it. Remnants of this worldview can still be observed in certain communities. In some traditions, spirits are believed to frequent springs or sacred water sources, and polluting these places with spitting or waste is strongly condemned. Among groups that preserved older beliefs, even casual disrespect toward water was thought to provoke supernatural displeasure. It is important to understand that water's sacred nature was defined differently from that of fire. Water itself did not actively purify other things. Its purity was fragile and could be destroyed by contamination. Fire, by contrast, possessed an active cleansing force. While water could be polluted, fire could burn away impurity. Because of this difference, fire often played the leading role in purification rituals. Nevertheless, water could still gain sacred significance during ceremonial bathing or ritual washing, where it symbolized renewal and rebirth. Like every feature of the natural world, rivers and springs were believed to have unseen guardians. Travelers occasionally interpreted the respect shown toward water as evidence of a water god. Yet this conclusion oversimplifies the belief system. The reverence directed toward rivers did not necessarily imply the worship of a single deity of water. Instead, each body of water might possess its own spirit or master. Certain early accounts describe how Turkic peoples expressed great respect toward both air and water. While clear proof of divine wind spirits from the earliest periods is rare, later traditions mention storm spirits that appear in whirlwinds of dust and violent winds. Determining whether these beliefs represented organized cults or simple ritual practices is often difficult. What is clear is that the invisible forces connected with water were thought to possess real power. Some sacred waters were known by specific names and locations. One famous example was a revered river associated with early Turkic ritual gatherings. Each year, during a particular time in the spring, people assembled near its banks to perform sacrifices offered to the sky. Such ceremonies reveal how water sources could become centers of communal ritual. Other sacred waters existed as well, sometimes unnamed but still deeply respected. In some cases, a particular river or spring was mentioned simply as a holy place without further explanation. A number of rivers held this status, and their significance was preserved through oral tradition. In Turkic languages, the word for the head of a river could also refer to its beginning or upper reaches. Earlier interpretations sometimes assumed that sacred waters referred specifically to springs, but closer study suggests a broader meaning. The sacred place might simply be the upper region of a river valley or the slopes of nearby mountains. In Mongolian ritual traditions, a large ceremony sometimes took place on the slope of a mountain chosen by the ancestors as a seasonal dwelling place. This detail suggests that sacred geography was often tied to specific landscapes, rather than isolated springs alone. Although a famous Turkic warrior once fought enemies near the upper reaches of a river, the battle itself was not necessarily about defending a sacred spring. The location simply happened to be where the confrontation occurred. Yet myths often connected the origins of clans with the sources of rivers. In one famous tradition, an ancestral figure was said to have been born near the headwaters of a great river. In many regions, springs themselves became holy places. Even in modern Anatolia, certain springs are still regarded as sacred and visited for blessings or healing. Throughout Inner Asia, sacred rivers were numerous and widely distributed. Some steppe traditions spoke of 10 great rivers that held spiritual significance. Among the Uighurs, several rivers were especially revered, while Mongol traditions honoured others, such as the Selenga, the Onon, and the Kerulin. Even far to the west, the Volga became associated with similar beliefs. Among certain Siberian groups, each river was thought to possess its own spiritual guardian. Some communities made offerings to these spirits in hopes of receiving fish or other resources. In other traditions, a river spirit might even be connected with the power to bring rain. Bodies of still water, such as lakes or pools, were sometimes believed to possess even greater strength than flowing streams. A lake represented a gathering of water, and like any concentration of objects, it was thought to accumulate power. The symbolic importance of water extended into language and metaphor. Some traditions compared deep wisdom to a lake or sea. Knowledge was described as something vast and unfathomable, much like the open waters. This symbolism appears in the titles of rulers and heroes as well. Certain names once interpreted as referring to princes may actually contain words related to lakes or waters. Over time, these titles evolved into grand epithets associated with vastness, such as ocean-like rulers, or leaders whose wisdom was compared to the sea. In later periods, similar expressions spread widely. Titles referring to oceans or seas appeared among rulers, religious figures, and scholars. Even in modern Turkish, the word for sea can be used metaphorically to describe someone possessing immense knowledge. The famous Lake Baikal was known as the Rich Lake, a place believed to contain extraordinary natural power. Words associated with wealth or abundance often carried deeper meanings as well. In some languages, they could also imply something sacred or forbidden, suggesting the presence of hidden spiritual force. Water could also symbolize a community itself. In certain texts, a great people is compared to a dark and endless body of water. The metaphor suggests both vastness and unity, much like a great lake whose surface stretches beyond sight. Because water reflects the sky like a mirror, it was often connected symbolically with heaven. Rain, descending from the clouds, and lakes reflecting the heavens, both reinforced the sense that water belonged to the same cosmic cycle as the sky. In later epic literature, a hero even declares that water has seen the face of God. Speaking to water becomes, in this sense, a way of addressing the divine presence itself. Shamans sometimes used reflective surfaces as tools for communicating with unseen spirits, and water naturally served a similar purpose. Stone and rock also occupied an important place in this worldview, though far less is known about their role. Some inscriptions associate stone with the idea of eternity. Certain monuments carved from solid rock were meant to preserve the memory of individuals forever. Ancient memorial stones erected beside graves carried similar symbolism. They ensured that the reputation and achievements of the deceased would not disappear with time. Some of these monuments were believed to hold spiritual significance as well. In many cases, rock surfaces were carved with figures of animals, humans, or mysterious symbols. These images may have contributed to the belief that certain stones possessed ancient power. Even in later times, people sometimes felt a profound presence near unusual rock formations. Although the surviving evidence is limited, it suggests that certain natural stones inspired reverence, or quiet awe. The connection between heaven and earth was also expressed through sacred movement. Rituals, visions, and symbolic journeys often described the passage between the human world and the sky. The ruler held a privileged place within this system. His relationship with heaven was believed to surpass that of ordinary individuals. Unlike the shaman, whose spiritual journeys relied on ritual techniques, the ruler was sometimes portrayed as being raised directly by heaven itself. Ancient inscriptions describe how the parents of a ruler were lifted upward by the sky and placed upon the throne. In this imagery, heaven itself elevates the sovereign and grants authority. Other traditions echo the same theme. The divine power above the sky raises certain individuals and brings them closer to the heavens. Coronation ceremonies often reflected this belief. The future ruler was seated upon a felt carpet placed on the ground. Elders delivered speeches reminding him of the virtues expected from a ruler and the harmony he must maintain between heaven and earth. The ruler and his consort were then lifted into the air by nobles and proclaimed sovereign before the assembled people. This symbolic elevation represented his connection with the sky. Legends also describe extraordinary beings capable of travelling through the cosmos in bodily form. Among these, sacred birds and dragons appear frequently. Birds, especially powerful birds of prey, symbolize the ability to rise toward the heavens. The eagle held a particularly prominent place. Its strength and its habit of nesting high in mountains made it a natural messenger of divine power. Stories describe gigantic eagles capable of devouring heroes, carrying them across vast distances and restoring them to life. In these tales, the hero undergoes a symbolic death and rebirth, echoing themes found in shamanic initiation. Such mythical birds resemble legendary creatures known across many cultures of Asia and the Middle East. Their presence in steppe folklore suggests that the motif is extremely ancient. The dragon occupies a similar role. This mysterious creature appears in various forms across Eurasia. Its body twists like a serpent, symbolizing endless motion and the cycles of nature. Some traditions associate dragons with water, storms, and clouds. They may rise from the earth, ascend into the sky, and descend again with the changing seasons. Because dragons embody both destructive and life-giving forces, they represent the tension between chaos and renewal within the universe. Another symbol capable of reaching the heavens was the arrow. Made from wood and often decorated with feathers, arrows combine the symbolism of trees and birds. When launched into the sky, they seem to connect human action with the upper world. In some traditions, the bow and arrow represented cosmic structure. The curved bow resembled the dome of the sky, while the arrow symbolized the axis linking heaven and earth. Firing an arrow upward could symbolize a gesture directed toward the divine. In mythic narratives, heroes sometimes shoot arrows toward the heavens in acts of defiance or communication. Other traditions imagine the rainbow as a bridge connecting the sky and the earth. Although evidence from the earliest periods is scarce, later folklore often describes it as a path between worlds. The nomadic tent itself mirrored the structure of the universe. Its central pole acted as a miniature axis connecting ground and sky. The smoke hole at the top allowed smoke to rise like a column reaching toward heaven. Fire played an important role in this vertical symbolism. Flames rise naturally upward, smoke carries offerings into the sky. When objects were burned, it was believed that their essence travelled upward with the smoke. Some traditions describe how burning written messages or images could send them to the world of spirits. Smoke became the invisible road through which gifts and news reached the beyond. Because of this belief, fires were sometimes lit during major events such as royal coronations. The rising smoke signaled the news to heaven itself. Funerary customs also reflect this idea. In some cultures, objects or images representing animals, tools, and possessions were burned so that the deceased might receive them in the next world. Despite these many symbolic pathways between heaven and earth, two natural forms stood above all others as cosmic axes: the tree and the mountain. These immense natural structures seem to bind the layers of the universe together. The world tree appears widely in steppe mythology. Sometimes it is described as a colossal pine whose crown reaches the dwelling place of the sky god. In other traditions, its roots penetrate the depths of the earth, while its branches support the heavens. Among the Yakuts, a great tree is said to stand at the center of the world. From beneath its roots flows a life-giving liquid that grants strength and vitality. Epic stories also describe enormous trees whose size surpasses all imagination. Their branches stretch so high that the sky itself seems to rest upon them. In shamanic practice, this cosmic tree often appears in ritual form. A tree trunk placed in the center of a dwelling represents the ladder by which the shaman ascends through the layers of the universe. Older legends hint that such beliefs existed long before they were recorded. Sacred trees served as places of worship, and people sometimes prayed before them or offered gifts. Mountains form the other great axis of the world. Rising high above the plains, they seem to support the sky itself. Their snow-covered peaks and hidden valleys inspired awe and reverence. Many Turkic and Mongol tribes possessed their own sacred mountain. These peaks were associated with ancestral origins, protective spirits, or legendary events. Some mountains were believed to be the birthplace of entire peoples. Others were thought to house powerful spirits that protected the land. Even when tribes migrated, they often transferred the sacred status of mountains to new landscapes. In this way, the ancient symbolism of the mountain continued to shape the spiritual geography of the steppe world. Through water, stone, fire, trees, and mountains, the universe was imagined as a living structure filled with invisible forces. Each element formed part of a vast system linking earth and sky, life and death, the human world and the realm beyond.